I gifted my parents a $450,000 seaside mansion for their 45th anniversary. But when I arrived to surprise them, I found my mother crying and my father trembling. My husband's family had taken over. My mother-in-law stepped toward my parents, pointed to the door, and yelled, "This is our house, get out!" That is when I walked in and the entire room fell dead silent. Before I tell you how I turned their arrogance into a federal investigation, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe to join a community of people who know that blood does not always mean family, and sometimes the best revenge is a quiet corporate execution. The South Carolina sun was beating down on the pristine driveway of the Hilton Head estate when I pulled up. I had spent 2 years searching for the perfect property, a place where my parents Jerome and Vivian could finally relax after decades of working multiple jobs to put me through Spelman College. The house was magnificent, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that perfectly framed the Atlantic Ocean. I had bought it entirely in cash through my private LLC, keeping the purchase quiet to ensure the surprise was absolute. I imagined their joy, the tears of happiness, the quiet satisfaction of finally being able to give back to the two people who had sacrificed everything for me. I parked my car, grabbing the custom-engraved keys I had prepared for them, my heart racing with anticipation. I pushed open the heavy oak front door, the scent of sea salt immediately replaced by the sharp metallic smell of tension. The foyer, which should have been filled with laughter, was a scene of utter chaos. My mother Vivian, a woman whose dignity had always been her armor, was standing near the entryway, tears streaming silently down her face. Her hands were shaking as she clutched her modest overnight bag. Next to her, my father Jerome was leaning heavily against the wall, his hand pressed tightly over his chest, his breathing shallow and rapid. Standing in the center of the living room, looking like she owned the world, was Beatrice, my mother-in-law. She held a crystal champagne flute in one hand, her posture rigid with an entitlement that turned my stomach. Flanking her was Julian, my husband's younger brother, who was currently sprawled on the custom white linen sofa I had carefully selected, his muddy boots resting on the coffee table. "I will not say it again." Beatrice's voice cut through the air, sharp and nasal. "Get your ghetto luggage off my pristine hardwood floors before I call security. You do not belong here, and you certainly do not belong in a neighborhood like this." My father straightened up, his voice tight, but remarkably controlled. "We were told this was a gift from our daughter Jasmine. We have the address and the access codes." Beatrice laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the high ceilings. She took a slow sip of her champagne before looking down her nose at my parents. "A gift from Jasmine. Please, my son is a corporate VP. He bought this house for my retirement. We all know your daughter's little diversity hire tech startup barely pays her phone bill. Do not act like your people belong in an estate like this. Now pack your cheap bags and leave before I have you arrested for trespassing." I stepped fully into the entryway, letting the heavy door click shut behind me. The sound was quiet, but it made Beatrice snap her head in my direction. "Beatrice," I said, my voice dangerously calm, the kind of calm that comes just before a hurricane. "What exactly are you doing in my house?" She didn't flinch. In fact, her smirk widened, a sickening display of unwarranted confidence. "Your house? Do not be ridiculous, Jasmine. Connor bought this for me. It is my retirement home. He transferred the deed this morning. Now be a good wife and explain to your parents that they need to leave immediately. They are ruining the atmosphere." My mind raced, trying to process the sheer audacity of her claim. Connor, my husband of 5 years, was a successful executive. Yes, but we kept our finances largely separate, maintaining only a joint account for household expenses. My tech platform, a luxury property management system, had been growing quietly and exponentially, a fact I kept shielded from his family's constant, exhausting scrutiny. Beatrice had always looked down on me, viewing my Spelman degree as a quota filled and my business as a cute hobby that kept me occupied while her son did the real work. "Connor did not buy this house," I stated, my eyes locked on hers. "I bought it through my company, for my parents." Julian scoffed from the couch, finally sitting up. "Yeah, right. Connor showed us the paperwork, Jazz. It has his name on it. Just accept that your parents need to find a Motel 6 down the highway. Before I could tear into Julian, the familiar hum of Connor's luxury sedan pulling into the driveway broke the tension. I turned toward the door, expecting him to walk in, see the madness his mother had created, and immediately clear up the misunderstanding. I expected him to apologize to my parents, to put Beatrice in her place, and to explain whatever chaotic miscommunication had led them here. Connor pushed open the door. His designer suit perfectly pressed his expression, one of weary annoyance rather than shock. He didn't look at my parents, who were still standing by the door, visibly shaken. He didn't look at his mother, who raised her glass in a triumphant salute. He looked directly at me, sighed heavily, and ran a hand through his hair. "Jasmine," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I told you to wait in the car. Mom is right. I transferred the deed. Your parents need to leave." Before the heavy oak door could even swing shut behind me, Connor grabbed my wrist. His grip was tight and bruising, a physical manifestation of the control he believed he had over me. He yanked me forward, pulling me away from the foyer where my parents stood trembling in shock, and his mother stood smirking with her champagne flute. He dragged me down the hallway and shoved me through the swinging doors into the massive gourmet kitchen. The stark contrast between the violent confrontation and the beautiful sunlit room I had secretly designed was jarring. I had personally picked out the gleaming stainless steel appliances, the imported white marble countertops, and the custom brass fixtures, envisioning my mother cooking her famous Sunday dinners in this exact space. Now the entire room felt tainted by his presence. Connor released my arm and immediately began pacing the length of the kitchen island, adjusting his perfectly tailored suit jacket. He did not look apologetic. He looked annoyed. He treated me not like a betrayed wife, but like a subordinate employee who had missed a critical corporate deadline. I ripped my arm back, smoothing the fabric of my sleeve with deliberate, agonizing slowness. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. I certainly did not cry. Tears are for the helpless, and I was anything but helpless. I just watched him, calculating every single movement, letting his arrogance dig his grave deeper with every passing second. "Are you out of your mind?" Connor demanded, his voice a harsh, aggressive whisper meant to stay contained within the kitchen walls. "I specifically told you to wait in the car until I handled the logistics. You just created an incredibly awkward situation for my mother." I stared at him, my expression completely hollow. "You transferred the deed to a $450,000 house that I bought." Connor let out an exasperated sigh, leaning against the counter and crossing his arms. He looked at me with the same condescending pity he reserved for junior staff at his firm. "Do not be hysterical, Jasmine." I rerouted the closing documents. I intercepted the digital files sent to the household email and forwarded them to my attorney. It was a simple administrative adjustment. "You are acting completely irrational over a basic asset reallocation." "Asset reallocation," I repeated, keeping my tone deadly flat. "You committed felony forgery. You stole a house." He laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, completely devoid of humor. "You paid for it with what, Jasmine? Your little diversity hire startup. Please. We both know I pay the mortgage on our primary house in Connecticut. I pay the car notes. I pay the utilities. I see our joint account every single day. Your little app development hobby barely brings in enough to cover your own phone bill." I took the liberty of optimizing our assets. Mom needed a secure retirement property, and frankly, considering how much I provide for this marriage, it is only fair that my family sees some actual benefit. His dialogue laid his fatal flaw completely bare. It was sheer, blinding corporate arrogance. For 5 entire years, Connor had refused to look at a single piece of paper related to my business. Early in our marriage, when I secured my initial seed money through a grant for minority women in technology, he had patted me on the head and called it a cute initiative. He never once checked the National Corporate Registry. He never saw the press releases about my Series A funding. He was completely oblivious to the recent Series B round that had exploded my company's valuation into the stratosphere. He only monitored the joint checking account I used as a decoy for basic household expenses. He genuinely believed that the $50,000 balance sitting in that account was my entire life savings, the absolute ceiling of my financial capability. He thought he had outsmarted a naive, struggling woman who was playing pretend on her laptop in the guest room. "So, you stole the house to give to Beatrice," I said, refusing to let my voice shake. "And my parents. The people who packed their bags thinking they were coming to celebrate their 45th wedding anniversary. Your parents can find a cheap motel off the highway," Connor said, waving his hand dismissively. "I am sure they are used to that. They have no business being in a gated community like this anyway. You know it makes Mom uncomfortable when they bring their loud, blue-collar energy around her friends. She owns the property now, and she does not want them here. Get them out, Jasmine. Do not make this harder than it has to be." The kitchen door suddenly swung open, interrupting Connor's aggressive monologue. Julian, my husband's deadbeat younger brother, sauntered into the room. He was wearing expensive boat shoes, tracking damp sand from the beach directly onto the custom tile floors I had paid to have imported from Italy. He held a bottle of imported beer in his hand, taking a long swig before laughing loudly. "Come on, Con. Tell her the best part," Julian said. His words slightly slurred. He leaned against the expensive refrigerator, looking at me with a smirk that perfectly mirrored his mother's condescension. "Mom is not even moving in." I shifted my gaze from my husband to Julian. "What are you talking about?" Connor shot Julian a warning look, but Julian ignored him, too drunk on his own perceived victory to keep his mouth shut. Julian set his beer on the pristine marble island, leaving a wet ring on the stone. "I am taking over the property," Julian gloated, puffing out his chest. "You know the boys in Vegas got a little aggressive about some outstanding markers I owed last month. The debt was getting heavy. So Connor came up with a brilliant executive strategy. We are turning this massive place into an illegal luxury Airbnb party house. It is the perfect setup. The neighborhood association does not allow short-term rentals, but since Mom is the registered owner on paper, we can bypass the local ordinances and run it entirely under the radar." I processed the information instantly. Connor was not just stealing a house to pamper his elitist mother. He was actively enabling his brother's severe gambling addiction and risking federal wire fraud to do it. "And the renovations?" I asked, smoothly baiting the trap. "This house needs significant upgrades to pass as a luxury party rental. Who is paying for that?" Julian laughed again, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed in the large kitchen. "Connor is a genius, Jazz. He pulled that 50 grand you had sitting in your little savings account to fund the initial contractors. Since it is marital money, he had every right to use it. Do not worry, we will make it back in a month. We already have high-end bachelor parties booked for the entire summer. You basically invested in my new business. You should be thanking me." I looked from my husband, the corporate thief who believed he was completely untouchable, to my brother-in-law, the degenerate gambler who could not keep a secret to save his life. They had completely drained my decoy account. They had forged federal real estate documents. They were openly planning to run an illegal enterprise using stolen funds across state lines. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought I was penniless, humiliated, and entirely helpless. They thought I would break down crying, run out to my parents, and beg them to find a cheap roadside motel while the Blackwood family toasted to their brilliant real estate hustle. They had absolutely no idea that they had just confessed to felony fraud on a property owned by an $18 million corporate entity. I looked at Connor, absorbing his smug, satisfied expression. I did not scream. I did not argue. I simply turned on my heel and walked out of the kitchen, ready to watch their entire world burn. I pushed through the swinging kitchen doors and stepped back into the sunlit foyer. The ocean breeze was still visible through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, a cruel and beautiful contrast to the absolute venom filling the room. My parents were huddled together near their luggage, exactly where I had left them. My father looked physically diminished, his immense pride taking a back seat to the sheer confusion and hostility of the situation. My mother held his arm tightly, her eyes darting between Beatrice and the heavy oak front door. Beatrice was no longer just smirking. She was visibly annoyed. She tapped her pristine manicured nails against the stem of her crystal champagne glass, her patience completely exhausted by the mere presence of my parents in what she had decided was her territory. Without a word of warning, she pulled her phone from her designer handbag and dialed. She did not step outside or lower her voice to afford anyone a shred of dignity. She wanted us to hear every single syllable. She spoke into the receiver with a sudden, breathless tremor that was entirely manufactured. She told the emergency dispatcher that aggressive intruders were refusing to leave her property. She claimed she felt physically threatened in her own home. She emphasized that the intruders were becoming hostile and unpredictable. Every word out of her mouth was a calculated weapon. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was setting a deadly stage. In this upscale, predominantly white enclave of Hilton Head, a panicked call about hostile intruders would trigger a massive and immediate police response. She was weaponizing her fragility, using the color of her skin and the prestigious zip code of my house to turn my parents into a perceived physical threat. Connor walked out of the kitchen just as Beatrice ended the call. He looked mildly inconvenienced, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit, perfectly content to let his mother unleash the local authorities on his wife's family. He looked at me and muttered that I should just get them out before this got ugly, acting as if he were granting me some kind of benevolent favor. I said absolutely nothing. I simply walked over and stood next to my father, placing a steady, reassuring hand on his shoulder. My mind was running 1,000 miles an hour, locking away my rage and replacing it with pure corporate calculation. Within minutes, the piercing wail of sirens shattered the quiet hum of the coastal neighborhood. The flashing red and blue lights painted the pristine walls of my foyer, reflecting off the chandeliers I had paid for. Heavy footsteps pounded up the front steps, and the front door was pushed open forcefully. 2 police officers stepped into the house, their hands resting instinctively near their utility belts. The crackle of their radios broke the dead silence of the room. The atmosphere instantly plummeted to freezing. The officers quickly assessed the scene, their eyes sweeping past Connor in his expensive suit, past Beatrice, who was suddenly clutching her chest in mock terror, and locking directly onto my father. They saw a tall, broad-shouldered African-American man standing near a pile of luggage, and their posture immediately shifted into high alert. Before either officer could even speak to ask what was happening, Beatrice rushed forward. She let out a perfectly timed, wavering sob. Her voice shook as she pointed a trembling finger directly at my parents. She told the officers that she had asked them nicely to leave, that they were trespassing, that they had invaded her peaceful retirement home, and were stubbornly refusing to vacate the premises. She played the terrified, helpless matriarch with Oscar-winning precision. One of the officers immediately stepped in front of her, holding up a hand to shield her, offering a reassuring nod. He had completely bought the performance without a second of hesitation. The second officer asked Beatrice if she had any proof of residence. Beatrice reached into her leather bag with dramatic urgency and produced a crisp, folded piece of paper. She handed it over with a sickeningly triumphant glare in our direction. She told the officer it was the transfer deed proving her son Connor owned the estate and had legally given her full occupancy. She told them we had absolutely no right to be here and demanded we be escorted off the premises in handcuffs if necessary. The officer took the document and scanned it. To an untrained eye, it looked completely legitimate. It had official-looking county seals, Connor's name printed boldly across the top as the primary owner, and what appeared to be my flawless signature at the bottom, relinquishing my rights. The officer folded the paper, his jaw tightening, as he nodded at Beatrice. He turned his attention entirely to my father. He took a deliberate, heavy step forward. He did not ask for our side of the story. He did not ask to see our identification. He unclipped the safety strap on his holster, his hand resting heavily on his radio, his entire body language shifting into combat readiness. He ordered my father to step away from the bags and place his hands where he could see them. The racial dynamics in the room were palpable, suffocating, and terrifying. My mother let out a sharp gasp, her grip tightening painfully on my father's arm. My father swallowed hard, his posture going rigid. He was a proud man who had worked his entire life to build a good name, but he knew the reality of the world we lived in. He knew that any sudden movement, any display of justifiable anger, Any attempt to argue his case could end his life right there in the foyer of the house his daughter had bought for him. Connor stood by the kitchen door, watching silently, perfectly willing to let my father be humiliated, or worse, just to maintain his arrogant lie. I moved. I stepped directly between the officer and my father, completely blocking his line of sight. The officer barked at me to step aside, warning me that I was interfering with a police investigation and would be detained. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands in surrender. I reached into my designer jacket pocket with slow, highly deliberate movements and pulled out my smartphone. I opened my company's encrypted administration portal. The biometric scanner read my face and unlocked the secure vault. I held the glowing screen up, holding it steady so the officer could clearly see the digital watermarks and the blockchain verification seals. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping every single ounce of emotion from my tone until I sounded like the ruthless chief executive officer I was. Officer, that piece of paper that woman just handed you is a complete forgery. I pulled up the actual digital deed, zooming in on the legal ownership registry. This property is owned by a private limited liability company. I am the sole proprietor and CEO of that company. My husband does not own this house. His mother does not own this house. They have no legal right to dictate who stands in this foyer. The officer blinked, his hand slowly dropping away from his belt as he leaned in to read the certified digital document on my screen. Beatrice stammered, her fake tears drying up instantly as her face drained of color. She frantically demanded the officer ignore my phone and look at her paper. But I was not finished. I swiped left on my screen, opening my cloud-based security archive. I looked directly at Connor, whose smug expression was beginning to crack. "Officer," I said, "not only is her paper fake, but I would be happy to show you the crisp, high-definition security footage of my husband sitting in my home office late last night, illegally accessing my physical files and forging my signature on that exact document." I turned my phone so both Connor and Beatrice could clearly see the video playing on the screen. The entire room fell into a suffocating dead silence. The lead officer took my phone from my outstretched hand. He scrutinized the glowing screen, watching the undeniable time-stamped footage of Connor sitting at my mahogany desk. The video quality was absolute perfection. You could see the nervous sweat glistening on his forehead in the recording. You could see the exact moment he slipped the fraudulent deed into his leather briefcase, after carefully tracing my signature. The officer handed my phone back and slowly turned his attention to my husband. The highly aggressive posture he had directed at my father completely vanished. Instead, he squared his broad shoulders and faced Connor, his voice dropping an octave into a tone reserved for actual criminals. He asked Connor if he wanted to explain why he had just presented a forged legal document to a law enforcement officer. Connor opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The arrogant corporate vice president was entirely gone. In his place stood a terrified, pathetic man whose fragile ego had just collided with reality at full speed. He began stammering, waving his hands frantically, claiming it was a massive misunderstanding between spouses, a simple marital dispute over asset management. Beatrice lost her voice entirely. She clutched her champagne flute so tightly I thought the crystal would shatter in her palm and slice her skin. The absolute horror of realizing she was the one standing on the wrong side of the law finally registered on her perfectly lifted face. Julian, sensing the walls rapidly closing in, slowly backed away toward the sliding glass doors leading to the patio. The second officer immediately stepped into his path, blocking his exit and telling him to stay exactly where he was. The lead officer looked at me and asked the question that could end my marriage right there in the foyer. He asked if I wanted to press formal charges for forgery, fraud, and filing a false police report. I looked at Connor. I wanted nothing more than to see him in handcuffs. I wanted to watch the police march him out of the luxury neighborhood he thought he owned. But then I heard a ragged, heavy breath behind me. I turned to look at my father. Jerome was leaning heavily against the console table, his face covered in a sheen of cold sweat. His hand was still pressed hard against his chest. The sheer terror of the last 20 minutes of being an older black man, threatened with immediate arrest in a wealthy, predominantly white neighborhood because of a malicious lie, was taking a severe physical toll on his heart. My mother was holding him, her eyes wide with lingering fear and exhaustion. My priority shifted instantly. Revenge is a dish best served cold, but protecting my parents required immediate de-escalation. I could not risk my father suffering a massive heart attack over a screaming match with my pathetic in-laws. I looked back at the officer. I told him that my primary concern was my father's health and removing these intruders from my property immediately. I stated clearly that I would be handling the forgery and fraud charges through my corporate legal team on Monday morning, but for right now I wanted Connor, Beatrice, and Julian escorted off the premises. Connor tried to step forward, his voice cracking as he pleaded with me to talk about this in private. He begged me not to humiliate his mother in front of the affluent neighbors. The irony was absolutely suffocating. He had been perfectly willing to let my parents be dragged out in handcuffs just moments prior, but now he was concerned about social appearances. The lead officer did not give Connor room to argue. He pointed toward the heavy oak front door and ordered all three of them to vacate the property immediately or face arrest for trespassing. Beatrice let out a highly dramatic gasp, dropping her champagne flute onto the floor. The glass shattered, the expensive wine soaking into the custom rug. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated hatred, but she did not say a single word. She grabbed her designer handbag and marched out the door, her heels clicking aggressively against the stone walkway. Julian followed close behind her, keeping his head down to avoid the officer's gaze. Connor lingered for a fraction of a second, opening his mouth to try and spin one last manipulation, but the stern glare from the police sent him walking out right behind his brother. As soon as they crossed the threshold, I pulled out my phone and opened my master administration app. With 3 quick taps, I completely wiped Connor, Beatrice, and Julian from the smart home access registry. I invalidated their digital key codes. I disabled the garage door openers. I locked them out of the neighborhood security gate network entirely. They were officially ghosts to this property. I thanked the officers for their time, assuring them the situation was completely under control. Once they left, I turned all my attention to my parents. I wrapped my arms around my father, feeling the extreme tension slowly leaving his broad shoulders. I told them we were not staying here tonight. The house felt polluted by Beatrice and Connor, and my parents deserved peace and luxury, not the lingering toxic energy of a crime scene. I grabbed their luggage myself and escorted them out to my car. We drove away from the Seaside mansion, leaving Connor and his family standing awkwardly on the sidewalk waiting for a ride, since they had arrived together in Beatrice's car, which was now permanently locked behind my smart gate. I drove my parents to the most exclusive 5-star resort on the island. I walked up to the concierge desk and booked their largest oceanfront penthouse suite for the entire week, paying the exorbitant premium without a second thought. Once we were inside the massive, beautifully decorated suite, my mother finally broke down. She sat on the edge of the plush, king-sized bed and cried, apologizing repeatedly for ruining the anniversary trip. I sat beside her, holding her hands tightly. I told her she had absolutely nothing to apologize for. I promised her that the people responsible for her tears would face consequences they could not even begin to fathom. I ordered room service, ensured my father took his medication, and waited until they were both resting comfortably before I stepped out onto the penthouse balcony. The ocean breeze was cool and sharp. The sound of the waves crashing against the shoreline below should have been relaxing, but my mind was running through 100 different corporate war strategies. My marriage was over. That much was undeniable. Connor had not just betrayed my trust, he had actively attempted to steal my property, humiliate my parents, and fund his brother's criminal gambling debts using my resources. I sat in the darkness for hours, running the numbers, planning the precise legal execution that would leave him completely destitute. I did not shed a single tear. Connor was not worth my grief. He was merely a poorly performing asset that needed to be aggressively liquidated. Eventually, pure exhaustion pulled me back inside the suite. I curled up on the sofa in the living area and managed to catch a few hours of fitful sleep. The bright morning sun streaming through the sheer curtains woke me up just before 7. I rubbed my eyes, feeling the heavy reality of the previous day settle back over my shoulders. I reached for my phone on the coffee table to check the time. The screen was completely lit up with a barrage of emergency notifications from my primary retail bank. My heart rate spiked as I tapped the first alert. It was a high-priority fraud warning regarding my joint checking and savings accounts. I quickly logged into my mobile banking app, my thumbs flying across the screen. The dashboard loaded, and I stared at the numbers in absolute disbelief. The account balance, which had been sitting comfortably at just over $150,000 the day before, now read zero. Connor had panicked. Knowing I was about to drop the full weight of my legal team on him for the forged deed he had logged into our shared household accounts in the middle of the night. Operating out of pure malicious desperation, he had executed a single wire transfer, completely draining every single penny we shared. Over $150,000 was gone in an instant. Before the heavy oak door could even swing shut behind me, Connor grabbed my wrist. His grip was tight and bruising, a physical manifestation of the control he believed he had over me. He yanked me forward, pulling me away from the foyer where my parents stood trembling in shock, and his mother stood smirking with her champagne flute. He dragged me down the hallway and shoved me through the swinging doors into the massive gourmet kitchen. The stark contrast between the violent confrontation and the beautiful sunlit room I had secretly designed was jarring. I had personally picked out the gleaming stainless steel appliances, the imported white marble countertops, and the custom brass fixtures, envisioning my mother cooking her famous Sunday dinners in this exact space. Now the entire room felt tainted by his presence. Connor released my arm and immediately began pacing the length of the kitchen island, adjusting his perfectly tailored suit jacket. He did not look apologetic. He looked annoyed. He treated me not like a betrayed wife, but like a subordinate employee who had missed a critical corporate deadline. I ripped my arm back, smoothing the fabric of my sleeve with deliberate, agonizing slowness. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. I certainly did not cry. Tears are for the helpless, and I was anything but helpless. I just watched him calculating every single movement, letting his arrogance dig his grave deeper with every passing second. "Are you out of your mind?" Connor demanded, his voice a harsh, aggressive whisper meant to stay contained within the kitchen walls. "I specifically told you to wait in the car until I handled the logistics. You just created an incredibly awkward situation for my mother." I stared at him, my expression completely hollow. "You transferred the deed to a $450,000 house that I bought." Connor let out an exasperated sigh, leaning against the counter and crossing his arms. He looked at me with the same condescending pity he reserved for junior staff at his firm. "Do not be hysterical, Jasmine." I rerouted the closing documents. I intercepted the digital files sent to the household email and forwarded them to my attorney. It was a simple administrative adjustment. "You are acting completely irrational over a basic asset reallocation." "Asset reallocation," I repeated, keeping my tone deadly flat. "You committed felony forgery. You stole a house." He laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, completely devoid of humor. "You paid for it with what, Jasmine, your little diversity hire startup? Please." "We both know I pay the mortgage on our primary house in Connecticut. I pay the car notes. I pay the utilities. I see our joint account every single day. Your little app development hobby barely brings in enough to cover your own phone bill. I took the liberty of optimizing our assets. Mom needed a secure retirement property, and frankly, considering how much I provide for this marriage, it is only fair that my family sees some actual benefit." His dialogue laid his fatal flaw completely bare. It was sheer blinding corporate arrogance. For 5 entire years, Connor had refused to look at a single piece of paper related to my business. Early in our marriage, when I secured my initial seed money through a grant for minority women in technology, he had patted me on the head and called it a cute initiative. He never once checked the National Corporate Registry. He never saw the press releases about my Series A funding. He was completely oblivious to the recent Series B round that had exploded my company's valuation into the stratosphere. He only monitored the joint checking account I used as a decoy for basic household expenses. He genuinely believed that the $50,000 balance sitting in that account was my entire life savings, the absolute ceiling of my financial capability. He thought he had outsmarted a naive, struggling woman who was playing pretend on her laptop in the guest room. "So you stole the house to give to Beatrice," I said, refusing to let my voice shake. "And my parents?" "The people who packed their bags thinking they were coming to celebrate their 45th wedding anniversary." "Your parents can find a cheap motel off the highway," Connor said, waving his hand dismissively. "I am sure they are used to that. They have no business being in a gated community like this anyway. You know it makes Mom uncomfortable when they bring their loud blue-collar energy around her friends. She owns the property now and she does not want them here. Get them out, Jasmine. Do not make this harder than it has to be." The kitchen door suddenly swung open, interrupting Connor's aggressive monologue. Julian, my husband's deadbeat younger brother, sauntered into the room. He was wearing expensive boat shoes, tracking damp sand from the beach directly onto the custom tile floors I had paid to have imported from Italy. He held a bottle of imported beer in his hand, taking a long swig before laughing loudly. "Come on, Con. Tell her the best part." Julian said, his words slightly slurred. He leaned against the expensive refrigerator, looking at me with a smirk that perfectly mirrored his mother's condescension. "Mom is not even moving in." I shifted my gaze from my husband to Julian. "What are you talking about?" Connor shot Julian a warning look, but Julian ignored him, too drunk on his own perceived victory to keep his mouth shut. Julian set his beer on the pristine marble island, leaving a wet ring on the stone. "I am taking over the property," Julian gloated, puffing out his chest. "You know the boys in Vegas got a little aggressive about some outstanding markers I owed last month. The debt was getting heavy. So Connor came up with a brilliant executive strategy. We are turning this massive place into an illegal luxury Airbnb party house. It is the perfect setup. The neighborhood association does not allow short-term rentals, but since Mom is the registered owner on paper, we can bypass the local ordinances and run it entirely under the radar." I processed the information instantly. Connor was not just stealing a house to pamper his elitist mother. He was actively enabling his brother's severe gambling addiction and risking federal wire fraud to do it. "And the renovations?" I asked, smoothly baiting the trap. "This house needs significant upgrades to pass as a luxury party rental. Who is paying for that?" Julian laughed again, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed in the large kitchen. "Connor is a genius, Jazz. He pulled that 50 grand you had sitting in your little savings account to fund the initial contractors. Since it is marital money, he had every right to use it. Do not worry, we will make it back in a month. We already have high-end bachelor parties booked for the entire summer. You basically invested in my new business. You should be thanking me." I looked from my husband, the corporate thief who believed he was completely untouchable, to my brother-in-law, the degenerate gambler who could not keep a secret to save his life. They had completely drained my decoy account. They had forged federal real estate documents. They were openly planning to run an illegal enterprise using stolen funds across state lines. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought I was penniless, humiliated, and entirely helpless. They thought I would break down crying, run out to my parents, and beg them to find a cheap roadside motel while the Blackwood family toasted to their brilliant real estate hustle. They had absolutely no idea that they had just confessed to felony fraud on a property owned by an $18 million corporate entity. I looked at Connor, absorbing his smug, satisfied expression. I did not scream. I did not argue. I simply turned on my heel and walked out of the kitchen, ready to watch their entire world burn. The red zero on the screen glared back at me. $150,000, the entire balance of the household account I used to pay the electric bill, and the landscaper vanished into the digital ether. Connor had initiated a wire transfer to a private offshore account at 3:14 in the morning. He had bypassed the dual authentication by routing it through our verified joint portal, a loophole he clearly thought made him a financial mastermind. A moment later, a text message pushed through at the top of my screen. It was Connor. He did not bother with a greeting. His words were a masterclass in narcissistic coercion. "You want to play hardball with the cops, Jasmine? Let us see how tough you are now. Check your bank app, you have zero cash. I took what is rightfully mine for funding your little lifestyle all these years. Sign the house deed over to Julian by noon today, and I might transfer enough back for you to buy groceries. Refuse, and you and your parents will starve in the street. You have no leverage. You have until 12. I sat back in the plush wicker chair on the penthouse balcony. The morning sun was warming the coastal air, and seagulls were diving into the Atlantic waves just beyond the pristine white sand. I read the text a second time. I read it a third time. I waited for the panic to set in. I waited for the crushing weight of financial ruin to buckle my chest. Instead, a low chuckle escaped my throat. The chuckle turned into a genuine full-chested laugh that carried out over the crashing waves. I covered my mouth with my hand, trying not to wake my exhausted parents sleeping in the adjacent master suite. Connor actually thought he had destroyed me. He thought he had cut off my life support. For 5 years, I had deliberately maintained a modest lifestyle. I drove a reliable sedan. I bought my clothes off the rack. I contributed exactly half to our joint household expenses, pouring every other waking second and every spare cent back into my property management software platform. Because Connor was obsessed with outward appearances, status symbols, and designer labels, he equated my lack of flash with a lack of funds. He viewed my frugality as poverty. He genuinely believed that the joint account represented the absolute totality of my net worth. He thought that $150,000 was my entire safety net. I picked up my phone and bypassed the retail banking application entirely. I opened a separate, highly encrypted secure folder and dialed a private, unlisted number in New York City. The line did not even ring a full time before it was answered. "Good morning, Jasmine," Marcus said. His voice was crisp, professional, and entirely unfazed by the early hour. Marcus was a senior partner at an exclusive wealth management firm that catered exclusively to ultra-high net worth individuals. He had been managing my private portfolio for the last 2 years, operating under ironclad non-disclosure agreements. "Good morning, Marcus," I replied, taking a slow sip of the rich, dark roast coffee the concierge had delivered earlier. "I have a slight logistical issue on the retail side. My husband just drained our joint checking and savings accounts. He executed a wire transfer for approximately $150,000 at 3 in the morning. I heard the rapid clicking of a mechanical keyboard on Marcus's end of the line. "I am pulling up the retail monitoring link now," Marcus said smoothly. "Yes, I see it." The funds were routed to a secondary account held exclusively in Connor Blackwood's name, and then immediately bounced to a holding account associated with Julian Blackwood. It is a highly amateur attempt at money laundering. "Did you authorize this transfer, Jasmine?" "Absolutely not," I said, leaning my head back against the chair and watching a sailboat drift across the horizon. He also just sent me a text message explicitly stating he took the money to extort me into signing over a piece of real estate. He put his entire blackmail attempt in writing. Marcus let out a sharp sigh of disbelief. "He documented his own felony. That is remarkable. Would you like me to trigger the federal fraud alerts with the retail bank? We can have the funds frozen and reversed within the hour, and they will automatically flag his accounts for a federal investigation." "No," I said instantly. "Do not reverse it. Do not flag it. Let the wire clear completely. Let him take the money and let him spend it on his brother's illegal renovations. I want him absolutely locked into this crime. When my divorce attorney subpoenas those records, I want Connor to have to explain to a judge exactly why he stole marital funds and moved them across state lines to fund an illicit enterprise." "Understood," Marcus replied, his tone approving. "We will let him hang himself. Shall I contact your legal team to begin drafting the asset discovery motions?" "Yes, please," I said. "But before you do that, Marcus, I need a status update on my actual capital. Connor believes he just bankrupted me. I want to know exactly where we stand as of the market open." The clicking of the keyboard resumed, followed by the soft hum of Marcus reviewing my secure portfolio. Connor had spent our entire marriage assuming my business was a failure because I never asked him for advice. He never bothered to ask how I was securing server space, how I was funding my payroll, or how I managed to acquire a massive market share in the commercial property sector without his brilliant corporate guidance. "Well, Jasmine," Marcus began, his voice taking on a note of deep satisfaction. The Series B funding round officially closed and cleared escrow late Thursday afternoon. The venture capital consortium fully funded the agreed-upon valuation. Your company is currently valued at just over $80 million. I took another sip of coffee, letting the heat wash over me. And my personal liquidity. Following the partial equity buyout you structured during the Series B round, your private accounts have been fully capitalized, Marcus read from the screen. You have $9.5 million sitting in tax-free municipal bonds and high-yield liquid cash equivalents. Combined with your remaining majority equity stake, your diversified investment portfolio, and your private real estate holdings, including the Hilton Head property, your current personal net worth sits at exactly $18.4 million. I looked down at the text message from Connor still hovering on my screen. He was threatening me with starvation. He was demanding I surrender a house I bought in cash, thinking I was completely destitute. Connor had just committed federal wire fraud, destroyed his marriage, alienated his in-laws, and handed me the perfect ammunition to ruin his corporate career, all to steal $150,000. He had risked a decade in federal prison to steal pennies from a millionaire. Marcus, I said, my voice perfectly steady. Connor gave me until noon today to sign over the house, or he promises to make my life a living hell. Would you like me to arrange private security for you and your parents? Marcus asked immediately. No, I replied, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across my face. I am perfectly safe. In fact, I have never been safer. I want you to initiate the aggressive asset protection protocols we discussed last quarter. I want a complete firewall built around my private wealth. Connor is going to file for divorce, thinking he is going to walk away with my decoy savings and force me to pay alimony. I want him to hit a solid brick wall of corporate litigation. Consider it done, Marcus said. I will coordinate with the legal team. He will not be able to touch a single cent of your actual wealth, and his theft of the joint account will be heavily penalized during the division of assets. I thanked Marcus and ended the call. I set the phone face down on the glass table and looked out at the ocean. Connor wanted to play hardball. He wanted to use my parents as leverage and treat me like a disposable asset. He thought he was the apex predator in this relationship because he wore an expensive suit and worked in a glass tower. He had no idea that I owned the tower. I checked my watch. It was just past 8 in the morning. I had 4 hours until his noon deadline. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my silk robe, and walked back inside the luxurious penthouse suite. I was going to let Connor wait. I was going to let him sweat watching his phone for a panicked response that would never come. I was going to let him believe he had won right up until the exact moment I pulled the floor out from under him. My parents were just starting to wake up in the next room. I needed to order them a massive room service breakfast, reassure them that our finances were more than secure, and prepare to execute the corporate slaughter of Connor Blackwood. The ocean breeze swept across the penthouse balcony, carrying the faint scent of salt and the distant cries of gulls. I sat in the plush wicker chair, my laptop resting on the glass table before me. The screen displayed the confirmation of Marcus's digital firewall. My $18 million net worth was now completely invisible, heavily encrypted and legally fortified behind a labyrinth of corporate shell companies and ironclad trusts. Connor had stolen $150,000, firmly believing he had severed my financial jugular. He was currently sitting in a stolen mansion, completely oblivious to the fact that he was bleeding out on my surgical table. Inside the massive suite, I could hear the soft, comforting sounds of my parents stirring. I had preemptively ordered the resort's signature luxury breakfast spread. Silver cloches, freshly pressed juices, and imported pastries now lined the mahogany dining table. I wanted them pampered. I wanted them insulated from the grotesque reality of Connor's betrayal. My father had spent 40 years breaking his back in a steel mill to ensure I could sit in boardrooms. He had earned his peace, and I was going to secure it by completely dismantling the Blackwood family. My encrypted mobile device vibrated against the glass tabletop, breaking the morning silence. The caller ID displayed a highly secured proxy number. It was Malik. Malik was the head of cybersecurity for my tech platform. He was a former intelligence contractor whom I had poached directly from a federal agency 2 years ago, doubling his salary and giving him carte blanche to build the most impenetrable digital infrastructure in the commercial real estate sector. He was fiercely loyal, surgically precise, and possessed a deep fundamental hatred for sloppy criminals. I picked up the device and accepted the incoming secure connection. "Good morning, Malik," I said, keeping my tone perfectly leveled. "I assume you received the executive briefing regarding the Hilton Head property." "Good morning, Jasmine," Malik replied, his deep voice crackling with professional intensity. "I received the briefing, and I have spent the last 3 hours running a comprehensive digital sweep on the property's network. The smart home infrastructure you had me installed during the renovation is functioning flawlessly. We have full administrative access, and I am actively pulling data packets from their local network. They are currently connected to the primary Wi-Fi." I smiled, a cold, sharp expression that did not reach my eyes. "Tell me exactly what the parasites are doing." Malik let out a heavy sigh of absolute disgust. "They are moving fast, and they are incredibly stupid. Julian Blackwood just listed the entire estate on Lux Retreats." Lux Retreats was our direct corporate competitor. They catered exclusively to high-end short-term vacation rentals, focusing heavily on bachelor parties, corporate retreats, and wealthy tourists who wanted minimal oversight. Listing my property on their platform was not just a violation of local zoning ordinances, it was a direct insult to my own corporate empire. He listed it for $3,000 a night. Malik continued, his keyboard clacking rapidly in the background. He uploaded photos he must have taken on his phone this morning. He is actively marketing it as a premier party destination, completely bypassing the gated community's strict background check protocols. He is guaranteeing instant bookings and immediate access. I leaned forward, my analytical mind instantly dissecting the logistical nightmare Julian had just created. Lux Retreats requires stringent host verification to process immediate bookings. They demand banking details, identity verification, and a primary contact point to clear the initial security algorithms. Julian has a credit score in the low 400s and a documented history of debt collection. There is absolutely no way his personal credentials cleared their host verification matrix. "You are exactly right," Malik said, a sharp edge of predatory satisfaction entering his voice. "Julian did not use his own credentials to bypass the security matrix. He used Connor's." I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. "Connor." Malik confirmed the fatal error. Julian registered the primary hosting account using Connor's credentials. But he did not just use Connor's personal email. Julian used Connor's official corporate vice president email address from his executive firm. He used Connor's corporate profile to guarantee the listing bypassed the fraud checks and set up the automated payment processing routing. The sheer magnitude of their stupidity was breathtaking. Connor was a senior executive at a highly prestigious, heavily regulated financial management firm. His corporate email was subject to rigorous compliance monitoring, SEC regulations, and strict internal auditing. Using that specific server address to register an illegal unzoned party house on a third-party application was a catastrophic breach of corporate policy. Furthermore, tying a corporate financial executive's identity to a bank account designed to receive unverified funds from strangers booking bachelor parties crossed the line from poor judgment directly into corporate malfeasance. Connor was actively intertwining his professional career with his brother's underground hustle. Connor's firm logs every incoming and outgoing communication on that server. I said, my mind racing through the legal implications. Every booking confirmation, every digital receipt, every guest inquiry is currently pinging directly into a monitored corporate database. Exactly, Malik agreed. The digital trail is completely irrefutable. We have the IP address logs showing the account was created from inside the Hilton Head property. We have the device identifiers confirming it was done on Julian's smartphone. And we have the host profile permanently anchoring Connor's corporate identity to the enterprise. They are currently linking the payout matrix to the same checking account Connor used to receive the stolen funds from your joint account this morning. It is a closed loop of absolute financial idiocy. Malik paused, the sound of typing ceasing. He shifted from an intelligence gatherer to a tactical operative. "Jasmine," I am looking at the smart home dashboard right now. I have absolute root access to every single system in that house. I can end this right now. Explain your parameters, I commanded, standing up and pacing the length of the balcony. I can remotely brick the biometric locks on the front and rear doors, Malik stated, his voice tight with anticipation. I can plunge the house into a total digital blackout. I will disable the primary and secondary HVAC systems, cutting off the air conditioning. I will shut down the water main via the smart valves. I will kill the Wi-Fi routers and trigger the localized security alarms to blare a continuous high-decibel siren. Within 30 minutes, that house will be an uninhabitable, sweltering concrete box. Simultaneously, I will launch a targeted denial of service request to Lux Retreats, flagging the listing as fraudulent and ripping it off their servers. I can digitally evict them and shut down this entire operation before they secure a single booking. Give me the authorization, Jasmine. Let me crush them. I stopped pacing. I looked down at the pristine white sand below, watching the tide slowly pull the debris back out to sea. The urge to authorize the strike was incredibly potent. I wanted to see them sweat. I wanted to see them locked out in the South Carolina heat, humiliated and defeated. It would be a swift, brutal, and highly satisfying tactical victory. But a tactical victory was temporary. I did not want to merely inconvenience Connor and Julian. I wanted to entirely eradicate their ability to ever threaten me again. I wanted a permanent structural destruction of their lives. Bricking the house and shutting down the listing would stop the immediate bleed, but it would also stop them from fully committing to the crime. Right now, it was just a fraudulent real estate deed and a messy marital bank transfer. I needed a federal anchor. I needed undeniable cross-jurisdictional criminal activity. No, I said, my voice dropping into a deadly absolute calm. Malik hesitated, clearly stunned by my response. Jasmine, they are actively attempting to monetize your property. They are disrespecting your asset. Let them, I replied. Do not touch the smart home systems. Do not trigger the alarms. Do not initiate any contact with the rental platform. Let the listing stay up. But they are going to secure bookings, Malik argued, his protective instincts fighting against my directive. They are marketing this to bachelor parties. They are going to start collecting deposits by this afternoon. That is exactly what I want them to do, I said, a cold, ruthless smile pulling at the corners of my mouth. Let them take the bookings. Let them collect thousands of dollars in deposits from unsuspecting tourists. Let those digital payments route through a third-party server cross state lines and deposit directly into an account linked to Connor's corporate executive profile. I stepped back to the glass table, looking at the glowing screen of my laptop. Every single deposit they accepted for a property they did not legally own constituted a distinct count of fraud. The moment those funds crossed a state boundary via the internet, it escalated from a local dispute into a federal jurisdiction. They think they are running a clever little side hustle, I continued, my eyes locked on the digital horizon. They are actually committing federal wire fraud. Every booking is another nail in Connor's corporate coffin. Every deposit is another federal charge for Julian. If we shut them down now, they get a slap on the wrist. If we let them operate, they build their own prison. Malik was silent for a long moment, processing the sheer devastating magnitude of the trap I was laying. When he finally spoke, his tone held a mixture of deep respect and genuine awe. Understood, Chief, Malik said. I am initiating a silent data capture protocol. I will mirror every single transaction, every message, and every IP ping directly to our secure offshore server. They will not even know we are watching. We will document every federal violation in real time. Perfect, I said. Keep the net completely invisible. Let them feel comfortable. Let them feel victorious. We set the trap, Malik. Now we wait for the rats to walk inside. I ended the call and slipped my phone into my pocket. I took one last deep breath of the ocean air, turning my back on the horizon. I walked back into the penthouse suite to join my parents for breakfast. They were safe, my wealth was entirely secured, and my husband was currently orchestrating his own spectacular demise. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, feeling more alive and dangerous than I ever had in my entire life. For 30 days, I completely vanished from Connor Blackwood's reality. I did not send a single angry text message demanding explanations. I did not leave any unhinged voicemails demanding the return of my stolen money. I did not show up at his corporate office to cause a scene in front of his colleagues. I gave him the absolute suffocating silence of a woman he believed was entirely broken and defeated. I knew exactly how men like Connor operated. He expected me to be hysterical. He anticipated a desperate pleading wife begging for scraps of her own savings just to keep her parents off the streets. When I gave him absolutely nothing, his massive, fragile ego filled the void. He assumed my silence meant total surrender. He genuinely thought I was destitute, living out of a cheap suitcase in my parents' modest guest room, completely paralyzed by the sheer financial dominance he believed he had exerted over me. He was wrong. My silence was not surrender. It was the sound of a guillotine slowly and methodically being raised into position. Behind the scenes, my war room was fully operational and ruthlessly efficient. With my $18 million portfolio fully secured and a massive corporate apparatus at my disposal, I assembled a strike team designed for absolute destruction. My wealth manager, Marcus, introduced me to Xavier. Xavier was not a traditional family law attorney who wasted time haggling over kitchen appliances, shared vehicles, and weekend custody schedules. He was a high-stakes, vicious corporate litigator who treated divorce as a hostile corporate takeover. During our first meeting in his sprawling, glass-walled office in Manhattan, I handed him the encrypted flash drive containing the 4K security footage of Connor forging the property deed along with the certified bank timestamps of the illicit wire fraud. Xavier did not smile. He simply nodded, adjusting his glasses immediately, recognizing that we were not negotiating a peaceful settlement. We were building a federal indictment disguised as a divorce. At Xavier's strict recommendation, I retained Kendra, a top-tier private investigator who specialized in forensic accounting, digital footprint tracking, and asset recovery. Kendra was relentless, operating with the precision of a heat-seeking missile. Within 48 hours, she had mapped every single financial move Connor and Julian made. She tracked the stolen $150,000 as it bounced from Julian's offshore holding account directly into the pockets of various shady, unlicensed contractors in South Carolina. She documented every forged building permit application Julian submitted to the city using my property's address. She even uncovered the specific offshore gambling markers Julian had desperately attempted to pay down using my purloined household funds. With Kendra gathering the necessary ammunition, Xavier filed my divorce petition entirely under seal. There would be no public notice, no dramatic papers served at the dinner table to give him a head start. Connor would not know I had initiated legal proceedings until the trap completely snapped shut around his ankles. We filed for an aggressive unilateral division of assets citing gross marital dissipation, felony fraud, and criminal conspiracy. We were locking down everything, preparing legal motions to seize his primary residence in Connecticut, freeze his retirement accounts, and liquidate his corporate equity to satisfy the impending civil damages. While I methodically prepared his utter ruin, Connor and his family were busy celebrating their perceived triumph. Drunk on their own arrogance and false sense of security, they completely miscalculated their actual position. Julian, believing he had successfully hijacked a pristine $450,000 coastal property, decided a quiet, under-the-radar launch for his illegal Airbnb empire was simply not enough. He wanted spectacle. He wanted to aggressively show off the stolen mansion to the world, assuming he was untouchable. Through Kendra's relentless digital surveillance, I watched their catastrophic plans unfold in real time. They decided to host a massive, highly publicized launch party at the Hilton Head estate. It was a display of hubris so profound it bordered on absolute comedy. They were not just inviting a few local friends to drink beer on the patio. Connor, ever the desperate corporate climber, sent formal digital invitations to his firm's senior partners and managing directors, falsely advertising the luxury estate as a new Blackwood family asset. Beatrice, eager to solidify her entirely fabricated status as a wealthy Southern matriarch, invited her entire country club circle, boasting loudly about her son's brilliant real estate acumen. Julian topped off the disastrous plan by paying local social media influencers to attend the event, ensuring the illegal rental business would be broadcast to hundreds of thousands of followers across multiple digital platforms. They were organizing a highly documented, incredibly public party at a property they did not legally own, funded by money they had explicitly stolen. It was a federal prosecutor's absolute dream scenario. There was, however, one significant logistical hurdle in their brilliant master plan. I had permanently locked them out of the estate. When Julian and Connor drove down to South Carolina a week before the event to oversee the party preparations and manage the caterers, they arrived at the front door to find their digital access codes entirely useless. The biometric scanners instantly rejected their fingerprints. The smart hub ignored their smartphone proximity sensors. The house was a sealed vault exactly as I had left it. A normal, rational person would have recognized the severe legal danger of the situation. A normal person would have realized that being locked out of an electronically secured property you allegedly owned meant the actual owner was asserting aggressive control. But Connor and Julian were far too deeply invested in their own lie to turn back. They had a massive party scheduled. They had powerful corporate executives and wealthy country club elites expecting a seamless luxury experience. They could not afford the staggering humiliation of admitting they could not even get through the front door of their supposed family estate. So Julian made the absolute worst decision of his entire life. He hired a local independent locksmith to physically break into the property. I sat in my secure home office in Rhode Island watching the live feed on my primary ultra-wide monitor. My head of cybersecurity, Malik, had established a direct, heavily encrypted stream from the Hilton Head property straight to my command center. Malik had personally designed and built the entire smart home security infrastructure for that specific gated community. My software platform did not just manage the locks on my individual house, it provided the hidden back-end security architecture for the entire neighborhood. We had digital eyes and ears on every single square inch of the perimeter. "He is actually doing it," Malik said over our secure voice channel, his tone a heavy mix of disbelief and professional disgust. He brought a physical locksmith to the front door. The technician is currently assessing the primary deadbolt housing. I watched the crisp 4K resolution video feed. The concealed camera, seamlessly integrated into the custom brass porch light, captured the locksmith pulling a heavy industrial drill from his canvas toolkit. Julian stood right behind him, nervously checking his luxury watch, while Connor paced on the pristine driveway, talking loudly on his cell phone. They were completely unaware that the property was silently logging every single action, beaming the high-definition footage directly to a secure offshore server hundreds of miles away. "Should I intervene, Chief?" Malik asked. His fingers flying across his mechanical keyboard, the rapid clicking echoing through the line. "I can remotely brick the internal locking mechanisms right now. I can trigger a localized security alert and have the private neighborhood patrol on that porch in exactly 3 minutes. We can shut this entire operation down before he even touches that drill bit to the brass." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, taking a slow, calculated sip of my black coffee. I watched the locksmith position the sharp drill bit against the hardened steel of my front door. I watched Julian cross his arms, looking smug, impatient, and entirely foolish. I watched Connor gesture aggressively while talking on his phone, likely assuring one of his senior corporate bosses that the upcoming party would be the exclusive event of the season. If I sent the private patrol now, Julian would simply claim he lost his keys. He would show the forged paper deed to the neighborhood security guards, create a massive administrative headache, and potentially escape the most severe federal charges. Simple trespassing and minor property damage were not nearly enough to satisfy me. I needed them completely inside the house. I needed them to bring the expensive caterers, the imported alcohol, the corporate executives, and the social media influencers. I needed them to fully execute their fraudulent enterprise in front of a captive audience of their peers. I smiled coldly at the high-definition monitor. No, I told Malik, my voice laced with absolute chilling certainty. Do not brick the locks. Do not call the neighborhood patrol. Tell the system to accept the physical breach and remain completely silent. You want him to drill the lock? Malik asked, pausing his typing for a split second. I want them inside. I confirmed, watching the drill bite violently into the metal on the screen. Let the locksmith break the door. Let them move their illegal contractors in to set up the bars and the lighting. Let them take thousands of dollars in bookings through Connor's corporate email. Let them commit federal wire fraud with every single transaction they process. Keep the cameras rolling in 4K. We are not stopping a break-in, Malik. We are documenting a massive criminal enterprise. We set the trap. Now we let them walk all the way in. The month of absolute silence culminated in this singular, highly orchestrated evening. Inside my secure Rhode Island office, my multiple ultra-wide monitors glowed with real-time data feeds. Kendra, my private investigator and digital forensics expert, had successfully mirrored the digital RSVP list for Julian's illicit launch party. Every confirmation notification pinged across my screen like a steadily ticking metronome, counting down the final hours to their absolute destruction. The guest list was an absolute masterpiece of corporate hubris. Connor had aggressively leveraged his executive title to invite 3 senior managing directors from his financial firm, 2 high-level compliance officers, and a handful of ultra-high net worth clients he was actively courting for his portfolio. Beatrice had mobilized her entire country club hierarchy, ensuring the local elite were present to witness her family's manufactured elevation in status. Julian had topped off the guest list by inviting a swarm of local lifestyle influencers, ensuring that every angle of the stolen property would be broadcast in high definition to hundreds of thousands of followers across multiple social media platforms. 50 prominent individuals were currently preparing to sip imported champagne on a property funded by stolen marital assets, sustained by federal wire fraud, and anchored by felony forgery. I stepped away from the monitors and walked into my dressing room. Tonight required armor, and I had selected mine with surgical precision. I slipped into a custom-tailored emerald green designer gown. The heavy silk draped flawlessly against my skin, projecting an absolute untouchable authority. I secured my hair into a sleek, severe style, applied a striking minimalist makeup look, and fastened the diamond earrings my grandfather had gifted me upon my college graduation. I did not look like a discarded penniless wife cowering in the shadows of a broken marriage. I looked like the apex predator Connor was too arrogant and too blind to recognize. A sleek black executive SUV idled smoothly at the curb when I stepped out into the humid coastal air. The driver, a towering man employed by my private security firm, opened the rear door. I slid into the immaculate leather interior to join my strike team. Xavier sat opposite me, his posture rigid, a thick combination-locked leather briefcase resting squarely on his knees. That briefcase was a weapon of mass financial destruction. It contained the finalized court-approved asset freezes, the sealed divorce filings, the emergency property injunctions, and a meticulously compiled evidence dossier destined for the federal prosecutor's desk first thing Monday morning. Next to him sat Kendra, her tablet glowing in the dim cabin light. She was continuously scraping the live digital transactions Julian was still foolishly processing through Connor's corporate servers, capturing every single illegal deposit as it crossed state lines. My parents occupied the middle row. My father, Jerome, wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit, his earlier humiliation entirely replaced by a quiet, dignified strength. My mother, Vivian, sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap over a silver evening clutch. The trauma of being threatened with arrest a month prior still lingered in the tight set of her jaw, but she held her head high. She knew we were not walking into a negotiation, we were walking into an execution. As the SUV pulled away from the curb and began navigating the winding coastal roads toward the gated community, the heavy silence in the cabin became palpable. The air conditioning hummed quietly against the tension radiating from the 5 of us. Vivian turned slightly, her gaze catching the neon glow of the passing streetlights. She looked at Xavier's locked briefcase, then at Kendra's scrolling lines of code, and finally at me. Jasmine, Vivian asked, her voice hushed, but piercing the quiet hum of the engine. Are you absolutely sure about this? Once we walk through those doors and expose them in front of their colleagues, there is no turning back. You are permanently destroying his entire life. You are dismantling his family. I met my mother's gaze, my expression completely devoid of any hesitation, fear, or regret. I did not feel an ounce of pity for the man who had stolen my money, forged my name, and weaponized local law enforcement against my family just to appease his elitist mother. They wanted to show the world exactly who they are, I replied, my tone dropping to a chilling authoritative register. I am just providing the lighting. Connor built this pyre all by himself. I am merely handing him the match. The SUV bypassed the main security gate seamlessly. Malik, monitoring the operation from my tech headquarters, had executed a backdoor override on the neighborhood's perimeter network, allowing us to slip into the enclave entirely undetected. We glided down the pristine, palm-lined avenues of the neighborhood and rolled to a smooth, silent halt directly across from my estate. The scene playing out before us was sickeningly extravagant. Julian had hired a fleet of private valets who were currently sprinting across the manicured lawns, aggressively parking luxury sedans and imported sports cars along the quiet residential street. The heavy, rhythmic bass of a live DJ thumped through the reinforced walls of the $450,000 property I owned. The heavy oak front doors were thrown wide open, spilling warm golden light, and the arrogant, echoing laughter of 50 elite guests out onto the sprawling front lawn. Waitstaff in crisp white shirts circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with top-shelf liquor and gourmet appetizers. I lowered the tinted window just an inch, allowing the humid, salt-tinged night air to rush into the quiet cabin of the SUV. My eyes tracked past the bustling courtyard, past the valets, and upward to the second-story master balcony overlooking the entire estate. Beatrice stood front and center, basking in the spotlight. She was wearing a glittering, ostentatious cocktail dress that caught the ambient patio lighting, making her look like the reigning queen of a kingdom she had stolen. She held a crystal champagne flute in one hand and a silver spoon in the other. She tapped the metal against the glass, the sharp ringing sound demanding the immediate attention of the wealthy crowd gathered below. Connor stood proudly to her right, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke suit, puffing out his chest as he soaked in the visible admiration of the senior partners from his financial firm. Julian leaned against the railing to her left, a smug, relaxed grin plastered across his face. He looked exactly like a man who believed he had successfully conquered the world and outsmarted the system. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for just a moment. Beatrice's voice carried clearly over the manicured lawn, perfectly amplified by the expensive commercial-grade outdoor sound system Julian had illegally installed on my property. I want to welcome you all to our new coastal retreat, but more importantly, I want to propose a toast. The crowd below quieted, turning their attention upward. The valets paused, the waitstaff stopped circulating. The DJ faded the music down to a soft ambient hum. To my brilliant, successful son Connor, Beatrice announced, her voice dripping with manufactured Southern charm and overwhelming pride, for securing this magnificent estate, for his tireless dedication to our family's legacy, and for bringing the Blackwood family the prosperity and status we truly deserve. The affluent crowd erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. Connor smiled a brilliant, practiced corporate smile. He raised his own glass, bathing in the fraudulent glory, accepting the congratulations of the men who controlled his professional destiny. Julian clapped his brother on the back, laughing loudly. I did not blink. I did not shift my gaze from Connor's smiling face. I reached into my emerald green clutch and pulled out my smartphone. I bypassed the biometric lock screen and opened my Master Smart Home Administration app. I stared at the digital dashboard, the glowing interface granting me absolute God-level control over every single electronic pulse security protocol and power relay coursing through that entire house. I looked at the smirking faces of my in-laws on the balcony, surrounded by the absolute pinnacle of their false reality. I slid my thumb across the smooth glass of the screen, bypassing the safety prompt, and pressed one single heavily encrypted button. The moment my thumb met the glass of the screen, the $450,000 estate died. It was not a slow, flickering fade. It was a brutal, instantaneous execution of digital power. The pulsing, heavy bass of the DJ's custom sound system cut off mid-beat, leaving a deafening, echoing void in its wake. Every single ambient light imported crystal chandelier and patio lantern went pitch black. Deep within the insulated walls, the electronic hum of the dual HVAC systems completely ceased as the massive fans spun down to a dead halt. Down in the basement utility room, the digital smart valves engaged with a heavy mechanical thud, violently severing the municipal water supply to every bathroom, kitchen sink, and wet bar on the property. The sudden sensory deprivation triggered an immediate, highly predictable wave of panic among the country club elite. Shouts of confusion erupted from the master balcony where Beatrice had just been toasting her golden child. The sharp sound of shattering crystal echoed from the stone patio as someone dropped a champagne flute in the blinding darkness. High-powered financial executives and local social media influencers began bumping into each other, their wealthy composure instantly evaporating the moment they were plunged into the pitch black. The stifling South Carolina heat, no longer held back by the massive air conditioning units I had personally purchased, immediately began to suffocate the packed, humid living spaces. From the gourmet kitchen, I could hear the frantic voices of the expensive catering staff. They were yelling about the sudden lack of running water, desperately turning silver faucets that offered absolutely nothing but dry, empty hisses. The commercial ice makers ground to a halt. The warming trays rapidly lost their heat. Connor's voice pierced through the darkness from the upper landing, barking frantic orders at Julian to check the main breaker box in the garage. Connor was in full corporate crisis management mode, desperately trying to save face in front of the senior managing directors who controlled his career trajectory. I could hear him loudly promising them that this was merely a temporary local grid failure, an insignificant hiccup in the luxury experience he had promised them. He was profusely apologizing to the head of his wealth management division, swearing that the backup generators would kick in any second. He had absolutely no idea that the local grid was perfectly fine. The failure was entirely, specifically, and maliciously localized. I did not wait for those non-existent backup generators to fail, because I had already instructed Malik to permanently disable the transfer switches remotely. I opened the heavy door of the black SUV and stepped out into the thick coastal air. My heels clicked rhythmically against the pristine asphalt. The private valets Julian had hired were running in frantic circles, shining their meager phone flashlights toward the darkened mansion, completely oblivious to the woman in the emerald green designer gown walking right past them. I moved with the precise, unhurried grace of a sovereign returning to reclaim her stolen territory. The heavy oak front doors were still wide open, exactly as Julian had left them, to welcome his high-profile guests. The physical deadbolts had been drilled out and rendered completely useless by the local locksmith he had hired earlier that afternoon. The locksmith had successfully breached the physical barrier, completely unaware that he was leaving the digital gates wide open for the actual architect of the entire system. I crossed the threshold without breaking my stride. The air inside the grand foyer was already growing thick and heavy with the scent of expensive designer cologne, panicked sweat, and imported catered food spoiling in the dark. I navigated the pitch-black hallway entirely by memory. I knew exactly how many steps it took to reach the grand living room, because I had personally signed off on the architectural blueprints and selected the Italian tile beneath my feet. I could hear the blind, chaotic shuffling of Connor's corporate bosses stumbling around my imported leather sofas. Voices overlapped in the darkness, complaining aggressively about the rising heat, questioning the stability of the power grid, and demanding someone find a flashlight. Julian's frantic, slurred voice echoed from the hallway, drunkenly yelling at a caterer to go outside and check the streetlights to see if the entire block was down. I reached the exact center of the massive vaulted living room. I stood perfectly still, letting the panic swirl around me for 30 agonizing seconds. I wanted them uncomfortable. I wanted them completely disoriented. I wanted the absolute peak of their vulnerable confusion before I pulled the curtain back on their pathetic illusion. I could hear the heavy breathing of a man standing less than 2 feet away from me, completely unaware of my presence in the dark. I raised my smartphone. I bypassed the standard ambient lighting protocols and accessed the emergency security override matrix. With a single deliberate tap on the glass, I commanded every single LED bulb, recessed spotlight, and multi-tiered crystal chandelier in the entire house to ignite at 100% maximum brightness. The resulting flash was spectacular and blinding. The sudden explosion of artificial daylight hit the 50 wealthy guests like a physical strike. People cried out in genuine shock, throwing their arms over their faces, squinting and stumbling backward as their pupils violently contracted against the glare. The grand living room was instantly illuminated with the harsh, clinical intensity of a surgical theater. The darkness was ripped away, exposing every single person in the room in high definition. The shadows vanished, revealing the sweating, disheveled reality of Connor's perfectly curated launch party. And there I stood, dead center in the blinding light, wrapped in vibrant emerald silk, my posture rigid and commanding. I did not flinch against the brightness. I stared directly up at the indoor landing, my expression carved from absolute ice. Beatrice had just managed to navigate her way down the sweeping master staircase in the dark. The sudden violent return of the lights caught her completely off guard. She shrieked a high-pitched, ungraceful sound that completely shattered her manufactured Southern aristocratic persona. Her hand jerked upward in shock, spilling her entire glass of imported red wine directly down the front of her pale, sequined cocktail dress. The dark crimson liquid spread across the expensive fabric like a fresh, bleeding wound. She blinked rapidly, her eyes watering against the glare, her vision finally focusing on the center of the room. When she recognized me standing there, looking like the executioner she never saw coming, the shock on her face instantly morphed into pure, unadulterated rage. The country club elegance vanished, replaced by the vicious entitlement of a woman who genuinely believed she owned everything she touched. She gripped the wooden banister with her free hand, pointing a trembling, wine-stained finger down at me. "Julian!" Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking with absolute hysteria as it echoed through the silent, brightly lit room. "Throw this pathetic woman out of my house immediately." I did not even grant her the dignity of a glance. I completely ignored her shrieking command, turning my back on the staircase and dismissing her existence entirely. I walked smoothly across the room toward the massive 85-inch smart television mounted on the far wall. I pulled a small HDMI adapter from my clutch, reached behind the screen, and plugged my iPad directly into the primary display port. The HDMI cable snapped into the port with a sharp, definitive click. Instantly, the massive 85-inch screen flared to life, cutting through the ambient light of the living room with a harsh blue-white glow. Beatrice's frantic shrieking died completely in her throat. The sudden illumination from the television washed over her wine-stained dress, casting long, distorted shadows across the imported Italian tile. I did not look at her. I did not look at Connor. I simply turned my back to the screen and faced the sea of 50 elite guests. The room was paralyzed in a state of absolute, breathless silence. The sudden digital blackout, followed by the blinding return of the lights, had already completely fractured their sense of aristocratic composure. Now they stood frozen drinks, half-raised conversations entirely abandoned, staring at the woman in the emerald green gown who had just seized total command of the environment. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice a single decibel above my normal conversational register. I spoke with the terrifying absolute calmness of a corporate executive delivering a quarterly earnings report to a hostile board of directors. Emotion was a liability. Data was an executioner. "Good evening," I said, my voice carrying effortlessly across the vaulted ceiling. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Jasmine. I am the sole legal owner of this property, and I would like to welcome you to the absolute conclusion of Connor Blackwood's career. I tapped the screen of my iPad. The television behind me instantly displayed a crisp, high-definition video file. The resolution was flawless, 4K captured by the concealed security lens I had installed in my home office months prior. The footage showed Connor sitting at my mahogany desk. The timestamp in the lower right corner glowed bright red, indicating the exact date and hour of the recording. A collective sharp intake of breath echoed through the living room as the guests watched the man of the hour meticulously hunched over a stack of legal documents. In crystal clear resolution, they watched a bead of nervous sweat roll down Connor's temple. They watched him hold a magnifying glass over a canceled check bearing my authentic signature. They watched him pick up a luxury fountain pen and painstakingly forge my name onto a federal property transfer deed. What you are currently watching, I narrated smoothly, pacing slowly across the center of the room, is Connor committing felony forgery. He intercepted the closing documents for this $450,000 estate, a property I purchased entirely in cash with my own private capital, and illegally transferred the title to his mother, Beatrice. I paused, letting the sheer weight of the federal crime settle over the crowd. I watched the faces of Connor's corporate colleagues. The senior managing directors, men who handled billions of dollars in client assets and demanded absolute compliance from their subordinates, were staring at the screen in unmasked horror. They were watching one of their rising vice presidents commit a devastating financial crime on a massive, undeniable scale. Connor lunged forward from the staircase, landing his face entirely drained of blood. His bespoke suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too large for his shrinking frame. Jasmine, shut this off right now. This is a deep fake. This is fabricated. You are having a mental breakdown. His voice was reedy, panicked, and entirely unconvincing. He sounded like a cornered animal realizing the trap had just snapped shut. I ignored him completely. I tapped my iPad a second time. The video of the forgery vanished instantly, replaced by a sprawling digital dashboard. It was the administrative backend of Lux Retreats, the premium short-term rental platform. The top left corner of the screen prominently displayed the verified host profile. It featured a professional headshot of Connor smiling his practiced corporate smile alongside his official vice president email address from his financial firm. For those of you invited by Beatrice to celebrate a new family real estate venture, I continued, gesturing gracefully toward the screen. I apologize for the extreme miscommunication. You are actually standing inside an illegal, unzoned party house. Julian Blackwood utilized Connor's verified corporate executive credentials to bypass the platform's security matrix and list this stolen property as a premier bachelor party destination. I tapped the screen again, highlighting a massive column of financial data in bright, unmistakable yellow. The numbers were staggering. Please direct your attention to the pending payout ledger, I said, my voice dropping into a deadly clinical register. Over the past 3 weeks, this fraudulent listing has secured 22 immediate bookings. They have collected exactly $80,000 in non-refundable deposits. Because Lux Retreats processes their payments through a third-party server in California, every single one of those deposits constitutes a distinct separate count of federal wire fraud. They used a corporate email address, governed by strict SEC compliance regulations, to guarantee the illegal transit of funds across state lines. The silence in the room was no longer just shocked. It was toxic. The country club ladies who had been eagerly toasting Beatrice moments ago were physically taking steps backward, treating her as if she were highly contagious. The financial executives were already pulling out their phones, likely drafting frantic emails to their legal departments to completely distance the firm from Connor Blackwood. Julian, who had been leaning against the railing trying to process the rapid destruction of his hustle, finally snapped. The realization that his entire digital scheme had been laid bare in front of a room full of powerful people completely bypassed his rational thought process. "Shut your mouth!" Julian snarled, his face twisting with drunken, desperate rage. He pushed off the railing and charged down the staircase, bypassing his frozen mother and brother. He lunged across the Italian tile, aggressively reaching for the HDMI cable, connecting my iPad to the television, determined to rip the presentation out of the wall by force. He never made it past the edge of the imported rug. Kendra stepped out from the shadows near the front doorway. She did not raise her voice. She did not adopt a fighting stance. She simply moved with the terrifying fluid efficiency of a highly trained operative. She intercepted Julian's path effortlessly, stepping directly into his personal space and planting her hand firmly against the center of his chest. The kinetic force of her block stopped Julian's forward momentum instantly, nearly knocking him flat onto his back. Julian stumbled, his expensive boat shoes skidding against the tile. "Get out of my way," he demanded, raising his arm to push past her. Kendra did not flinch. She casually reached into the inner pocket of her tailored blazer and produced a sleek leather wallet. She flipped it open with a flick of her wrist, displaying a heavy silver badge and a set of credential cards that gleamed under the harsh living room lights. "I am a licensed private investigator specializing in financial forensics and asset recovery," Kendra stated, her voice projecting a cold, unwavering authority that instantly commanded the room. "If you take one more step toward my client, I will legally categorize it as an assault, and you will leave this property in handcuffs before the local police even finish reading the wire fraud statutes." Julian froze, his eyes locked on the badge, his drunken courage evaporating into thin air. "Furthermore," Kendra continued, her tone conversational but entirely lethal, "I highly advise against damaging that screen, Julian. You really need to see the next slide. We found the markers." At the word markers, Julian's face went entirely slack. The aggressive, entitled posture he had maintained all evening completely collapsed. He looked like a man who had just been handed his own death warrant. I tapped the screen for the third time. The Lux Retreat's dashboard vanished, replaced by a stark black and white digital ledger. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting pulled directly from encrypted offshore servers. The names of 3 highly unlicensed, extremely dangerous creditors operating out of Macau and Las Vegas were listed in bold font. Beneath each name was a staggering sum of outstanding debt, all directly tied to Julian Blackwood's encrypted identity. $80,000 in fraudulent rental deposits, I announced, letting the numbers burn into the retinas of every guest in the room. Collected through a highly illegal enterprise specifically designed to quickly cover $65,000 in outstanding offshore gambling debts. You were not building a real estate empire, Julian. You were desperately trying to stop violent men from breaking your legs, and you used my house and your brother's corporate career to do it. The room was entirely dismantled. Beatrice had sunk down onto the middle step of the staircase, her hands covering her face, quietly weeping into her ruined, wine-stained dress. Julian was staring at the floor, completely defeated by the sheer volume of evidence stacked against him. Connor was leaning heavily against the banister, his breathing shallow and rapid, his eyes darting frantically around the room, desperately searching for a single friendly face. He found absolutely none. I surveyed the devastation, feeling a profound, terrifying sense of absolute clarity. I had brought them to their knees without raising my voice, without shedding a single tear, and without firing a single physical shot. I had used their own boundless arrogance to build the very cage they were now trapped inside. But I was not entirely finished. I turned my attention away from the ruined Blackwood family and scanned the silent crowd of guests. My eyes locked onto a tall, distinguished man standing near the back patio doors. He was wearing a tailored navy suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his expression an impenetrable mask of pure corporate calculation. It was Richard Sterling, the absolute apex predator of Connor's financial firm. He was the chief executive officer, the man who ultimately controlled every promotion, every termination, and every shred of corporate liability the firm possessed. I held Sterling's gaze for 3 very long, very deliberate seconds. I wanted him to understand exactly who was controlling the narrative. I wanted him to recognize that I was not a chaotic, emotional spouse seeking petty revenge. I was a tactical operator executing a flawless corporate liquidation. I smiled, turning back to my iPad. "Now," I said, my voice echoing through the deafening silence as I prepared to deliver the ultimate killing blow. "We have established the forgery. We have documented the wire fraud. We have exposed the offshore gambling debt motivating the entire criminal enterprise. I let my finger hover over the glass screen, locking eyes with the CEO one final time. Let's look at exactly whose money funded this little party. My finger tapped the glass surface of the iPad a final time. The massive 85-inch screen behind me flickered, wiping away the offshore gambling markers and replacing them with a series of high-resolution, meticulously highlighted corporate banking statements. These were not standard retail checking accounts. The documents displayed the distinct proprietary watermarks of Richard Sterling's global financial firm. The red boxes I had digitally drawn on the screen illuminated a sequence of massive, highly irregular expenditures. Connor had a severe logistical problem when he decided to hijack this coastal property. The decoy account he had drained from me only held $150,000. While that was a substantial sum, it was not nearly enough to cover Julian's aggressive offshore debts, the luxury contractors, the rush delivery on the commercial-grade outdoor sound system, and the sheer volume of top-tier catering required to impress a crowd of 50 elite corporate guests. He needed a massive injection of liquid capital to pull off this launch party and float the renovations until the illegal rental deposits officially cleared his bank on Monday morning. So my brilliant, untouchable husband did what arrogant men always do when they believe they are the smartest person in the room. He dipped his hands into a pocket that did not belong to him. You see, I projected my voice clearly over the stunned silence of the living room. Connor assumed he had orchestrated the perfect closed-loop financial bridge. He utilized his corporate executive platinum card to authorize $75,000 in unauthorized cash advances and direct vendor payments. He funneled firm capital directly into Julian's shell company to pay for the bartenders, the valet service, and the premium liquor you are all currently drinking. He treated his corporate treasury like a personal payday loan, fully intending to replace the missing funds on Monday using the deposits from the illegal wire fraud. I stepped to the side, allowing the sheer magnitude of the evidence to dominate the room. The screen displayed the exact routing numbers, the corporate approval stamps Connor had falsified, and the digital receipts linking the firm's money directly to the party happening right now. Richard Sterling stepped forward from the back of the room. The CEO of a firm that managed billions in client assets was currently looking at clear, undeniable proof that his vice president of wealth management was an embezzler. Sterling's face did not just flush. It turned a deep, mottled shade of purple. The veins in his neck stood out against the crisp white collar of his dress shirt. Sterling did not ask Connor for an explanation. He did not ask if the documents were real. Men at his level of corporate warfare recognized a lethal liability the second they saw one. He pulled a sleek smartphone from his tailored jacket and dialed a number, pressing the device hard against his ear. "Get me the general counsel right now," Sterling barked into the phone, his voice echoing with absolute authority. He did not break eye contact with Connor. "I want Connor Blackwood's corporate access completely severed. Freeze his terminal, lock down his keycard, flag every single client portfolio he has touched in the last 36 months for an immediate internal audit. I want building security waiting at his desk on Monday morning to box up his personal effects." "Richard, please, you have to listen to me," Connor pleaded, his voice cracking entirely. He pushed away from the staircase banister, holding his hands up in a desperate, placating gesture. "This is a severe misunderstanding. It was a temporary liquidity bridge. I filed the authorization forms. I can replace the capital by Monday. The funds are already pending in my secondary account. I was going to balance the ledger." "You utilized SEC-regulated corporate funds to float an illegal real estate scheme," Sterling snapped, his voice dropping into a terrifyingly quiet register. "You committed embezzlement, Connor. You defrauded this firm and you brought me to a stolen house to celebrate it. Do not ever attempt to contact me or anyone at my firm again. You will be hearing from federal regulators." Sterling turned on his heel, signaling to the other senior executives in the room. They immediately set their champagne flutes down on the nearest tables and moved toward the front door in a unified, silent exodus. They treated Connor like a man who had just been diagnosed with a highly contagious fatal disease. Beatrice let out a strangled, weeping gasp from the staircase. She scrambled to her feet, her high heels catching on the hem of her ruined, wine-stained dress. Richard, wait! She cried out, stumbling down the remaining steps. Connor is a good boy. He is a brilliant executive. This is all her fault. Jasmine is trying to ruin him because she is jealous. Sterling did not even pause his stride. He walked straight past Beatrice, stepping out the front door and disappearing into the humid coastal night, taking Connor's entire professional future with him. The remaining country club guests began a frantic, panicked scramble for the exit. No one wanted to be associated with a federal crime scene. Women in expensive dresses and men in linen suits practically shoved each other out of the way to reach the driveway. Julian, sensing the absolute collapse of his entire world, tried to quietly slide along the wall toward the kitchen doors. He thought he could slip out the back and disappear into the night. Kendra stepped smoothly into his path, her posture perfectly relaxed, but undeniably lethal. She crossed her arms, blocking the doorway completely. "Leaving so soon, Julian?" she asked, her voice laced with cold amusement. "The local authorities have already been dispatched. They are going to have several questions about those offshore markers and the drilled locks on the front door. I highly recommend you stay exactly where you are." Julian backed away, his hands raised in surrender, his bravado entirely crushed under the weight of his impending arrest. Connor was left standing in the center of the rapidly emptying room. His corporate bosses were gone. His brother was trapped. His mother was sobbing hysterically on the floor. His career was completely obliterated. He slowly turned his head to look at me. The panic in his eyes was instantly swallowed by a massive, violent surge of narcissistic rage. The facade of the polished, sophisticated executive burned away, leaving only a vicious, cornered abuser. He marched across the Italian tile, closing the distance between us, until he was standing less than 2 feet away. His chest heaved with heavy, ragged breaths. His face was red and sweating, his perfectly styled hair now sticking to his forehead. "You think you won?" Connor snarled, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "You think destroying my job changes anything? You are nothing without me, Jasmine. You are a penniless, irrelevant nobody playing pretend on a laptop." I stood perfectly still, my expression an unreadable mask of ice. I let him exhaust his venom. I let him dig his grave deeper. "I pay for your life!" Connor screamed, the volume of his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "I put a roof over your head. I fund your existence. You have exactly $0 to your name because I took it all this morning. You cannot afford to fight me. I will drag you through court for years. I will bury you in legal fees until you are completely bankrupt. I will force you to sell your parents' house just to afford a discount attorney. You are broke. You are entirely destitute. You cannot touch me." He was breathing heavily, a wild, deranged smile stretching across his face as he clung to the only piece of leverage he believed he still possessed. He genuinely thought that stealing my $150,000 decoy account gave him absolute financial supremacy. A sharp, rhythmic clicking of polished leather shoes against the tile floor broke the tension. Xavier stepped out from the shadows near the grand entryway. He moved with the smooth, predatory elegance of a man who destroyed corporate empires for a living. He was wearing an impeccably tailored charcoal gray Tom Ford suit, his silver tie perfectly knotted. He carried his heavy combination-locked leather briefcase in his left hand. Connor stopped his screaming, his eyes darting toward the imposing man approaching him. "Who the hell are you?" Connor demanded, his voice wavering slightly. "Get out of my house." "This is not your house, Mr. Blackwood," Xavier replied. His voice was incredibly smooth, carrying a calm, devastating authority that instantly overpowered Connor's frantic screaming. "And I am not leaving." Xavier stopped directly beside me. He set his briefcase on the glass coffee table, spinning the combination dials with 3 rapid clicks. The brass latches snapped open. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. It was bound with a thick rubber band and stamped with the bright red seal of the state family court. He held the folder out, pressing it firmly against Connor's chest. Connor instinctively raised his hands to take it, his eyes wide with sudden, unadulterated fear. "My name is Xavier Sterling," he said, his tone perfectly conversational and utterly ruthless. "I am the senior managing partner of Sterling and Vance Litigation. I have been retained as lead counsel for your wife in the matter of your impending, highly aggressive divorce." Connor stared at the heavy folder in his hands, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Xavier adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket, looking at Connor with the mild disgust of a man scraping something unpleasant off the bottom of his shoe. "Consider yourself served," Xavier stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "And I suggest you read page 4 regarding my client's financial disclosures." Connor's fingers were trembling so violently he could barely grip the thick edge of the manila folder. He fumbled with the heavy paper, his manicured thumb slipping against the corner, before finally flipping past the initial injunctions and emergency restraining orders. He turned to page 4. I watched the exact millisecond his reality fractured. It began in his eyes. His pupils dilated, sweeping frantically back and forth across the meticulously itemized spreadsheet produced by my forensic accountants. The document detailed my private, highly shielded financial holdings. It listed the diverse portfolio of commercial real estate I had acquired over the past 7 years. It documented my controlling stake in a highly lucrative cybersecurity firm based out of Rhode Island. It showed my liquid assets safely insulated in private trusts entirely separate from our daily marital accounts. At the very bottom of the page, highlighted in bold black ink, was the certified, legally binding total of my personal net worth, $18 million. Connor's breath hitched, a wet, choking sound escaping his throat. He read the number again, then he read it a third time, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The arrogant, posturing executive who had just seconds ago screamed that I was a penniless nobody suddenly realized he was nothing but an insignificant parasite clinging to the hull of a massive financial dreadnought. He had just stolen $150,000 from a woman who could buy and sell his entire corporate division without checking her bank balance. The physical reaction was absolute and involuntary. The remaining color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. His hands shook so violently, the heavy legal document slipped from his grasp, the pages fluttering down to scatter across the floor. Then his knees literally buckled. He did not stagger. He dropped. The sharp, heavy sound of his kneecaps striking the hard Italian tile echoed sharply through the cavernous living room. He remained there on the floor, staring blankly ahead, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his own insignificance. Xavier stood over him, adjusting his suit jacket with an air of profound boredom. "The $150,000 you unlawfully transferred from my client's secondary decoy account has already been flagged by federal banking regulators," Xavier stated, his voice ringing clearly in the silent room. "My client intentionally left that account vulnerable to test the extent of your financial desperation. You fell for the bait flawlessly. You are currently facing charges for felony forgery, grand larceny, and corporate embezzlement. My client will not be seeking a settlement. She will be seeking your total incarceration." The hushed whispers began instantly. The remaining guests, the country club socialites and local influencers who had been too terrified to run out the front door with the corporate executives, were staring at the scattered documents on the floor. The number began to circulate through the crowd like an electric current. 18 million. I heard a woman in a designer silk-wrapped dress gasp out loud. I saw a local real estate broker aggressively whispering the figure to his wife. The sheer irony of the situation struck them all simultaneously. Connor had been parading around, aggressively boasting about securing a $450,000 property, acting like the undisputed king of the coastal elite. Meanwhile, the quiet, discarded wife he had publicly humiliated and attempted to bankrupt possessed enough liquid capital to bulldoze the entire neighborhood and build it back from scratch. He had been playing with pennies while I controlled the bank. I looked down at Connor. He was still kneeling on the floor, completely broken. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and hollow, silently begging for some kind of explanation, some sign that this was a nightmare he could wake up from. "You told me success requires anticipation of obstacles, Connor," I said, my tone perfectly even. "I simply anticipated you. You dug this grave with your own arrogance. I just purchased the headstone." Beatrice, still crumpled on the lower stairs, suddenly snapped her head up. The sound of the massive net worth had pierced through her hysterical sobbing. She looked at her golden child kneeling in defeat on the floor, and then she looked at me. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had entirely inverted. She was no longer the matriarch of a rising dynasty. She was the mother of two impending felons standing in a house she did not own, surrounded by people who were about to watch her lose everything. But Beatrice Blackwood was a creature of intense social survival. When cornered, she reverted to the only strategy she knew. She attempted to weaponize her tears. She forced herself to her feet, her hands clutching the ruined wine-soaked fabric of her dress. She turned her attention away from me and focused entirely on the remaining country club guests huddled near the kitchen island. These were her people. These were the women she played tennis with, the women she gossiped with, the women who validated her manufactured social standing. "Look at what she has done to us!" Beatrice wailed, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated theatrical agony. She stumbled toward a group of older women wearing expensive pearls and tense expressions. "Look at this cruel, lying woman. She manipulated all of us." Beatrice reached out her hands, shaking tears streaming down her carefully lifted face. She tried to grab the arm of a prominent local socialite named Martha. "She hid this money from her own husband." Beatrice sobbed loudly, projecting her voice so the entire room could hear the tragedy of her narrative. "She let my poor Connor stress himself to death trying to provide for her. She deceived this family. She set a trap to destroy my boys just because she is a bitter, vindictive sociopath. Martha, you have to help us. You know we are good people. You know Connor is a good man. She orchestrated this entire nightmare just to humiliate us in front of our friends." Beatrice stood there weeping, extending her hands, waiting for the familiar warmth of social solidarity. She expected Martha to step forward to offer a comforting embrace to validate her victimhood and condemn the cruel daughter-in-law. Martha did not step forward. Instead, Martha looked at Beatrice's outstretched hands, then glanced up at the massive 85-inch screen that was still displaying Connor's fraudulent corporate bank transfers and Julian's offshore gambling debt markers. The reality of the situation was undeniable. The country club friends were not looking at a grieving mother and her persecuted sons. They were looking at a family of aggressive, sloppy criminals. Martha physically recoiled, taking a large, deliberate step backward. She pulled her arm away from Beatrice's grasp, as if the woman were covered in battery acid. "Do not touch me, Beatrice," Martha said, her voice dripping with absolute, unfiltered disgust. The other women in this group immediately mirrored Martha's reaction. They backed away, their faces twisting with repulsion. One woman quickly set her half-empty champagne glass down on the granite counter and vigorously wiped her hand on a napkin, horrified that she had consumed anything provided by this family. "You brought us to a crime scene," another woman hissed, clutching her designer purse tightly against her chest. "You invited us to drink champagne paid for with embezzled corporate funds. My husband is a senior partner at a law firm, Beatrice. If his name is dragged into a federal wire fraud investigation because you wanted to show off a house you stole, I will personally see to it that you never show your face in this town again. Please." Beatrice begged, her theatrical tears rapidly transforming into genuine suffocating panic as she watched her entire social foundation crumble. "We are the victims here. You have to believe me. She tricked us." "You are a thief," Martha snapped, turning her back on Beatrice completely. "And your sons are felons. Do not ever call my phone again." The social excommunication was instantaneous and absolute. Beatrice was left standing alone in the center of the kitchen, her hands still reaching out to avoid. She had spent decades cultivating her pristine reputation, manipulating everyone around her to ensure the Blackwood name was synonymous with coastal elegance. Now she was radioactive. No one in that room would ever associate with her again. She would be the absolute laughingstock of the country club, a cautionary tale of hubris and fraud. I watched Beatrice slowly collapse inward, her posture completely giving way as the reality of her total social destruction finally settled over her. She sank to the floor, her wine-stained dress pooling around her, weeping alone in the harsh, bright lights of my living room. Connor remained on his knees, his eyes fixed on the scattered pages of the divorce filing. Julian was pinned near the front door, watched closely by Kendra, who stood ready to physically restrain him if he made a single sudden movement. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the sound of Beatrice's pathetic, ragged sobs. The remaining guests were clustered together, casting terrified glances toward the front door, desperate to leave, but entirely unsure if they were legally permitted to exit an active crime scene. I smoothed the silk fabric of my emerald gown. I had reclaimed my property. I had secured my assets. I had absolutely dismantled the people who had attempted to break me. You wanted to show everyone who you truly were, I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the quiet room, addressed to the three broken figures scattered across my floor. Mission accomplished. Before any of them could respond, the heavy, humid darkness outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows was violently pierced. A blinding flash of red and blue light swept across the manicured front lawn, casting rapid, dizzying shadows against the interior walls of the living room. The strobing lights multiplied, as a second, then a third vehicle aggressively mounted the curb, tearing through the pristine landscaping. The deafening, high-pitched wail of police sirens tore through the coastal night air, vibrating the glass panes and echoing loudly against the vaulted ceilings. The authorities had arrived. The heavy oak front doors, already breached by Julian's hired locksmith, offered absolutely no resistance. Four uniformed officers breached the threshold first, their heavy tactical boots thudding against the imported Italian tile. Their hands rested cautiously on their duty belts, their eyes sweeping the massive, brightly lit living room. Behind them walked two plainclothes detectives wearing severe expressions and dark windbreakers. The red and blue strobe lights from the cruisers idling on the manicured lawn washed through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, casting harsh, alternating colors across the faces of the terrified country club elite. The remaining guests pressed themselves flat against the walls, desperately trying to merge with the expensive wallpaper. No one spoke. The only sound was the sharp metallic crackle of a police radio breaking the silence. Kendra stepped forward from her position near the doorway. She did not look like a woman caught in a raid. She looked like a commanding officer receiving her reinforcements. She bypassed the uniformed officers entirely and walked directly up to the lead detective, a tall, broad-shouldered man with silver hair at his temples. "Detective Russo," Kendra said, her voice carrying a crisp professional authority. "Thank you for the rapid response time." "Kendra," Russo replied, offering a tight, acknowledging nod. "Your secure transmission bypassed the standard dispatch queue straight to the Economic Crimes Division. You stated you had a live in-progress federal violation." "I have multiple," Kendra stated cleanly. She reached into her tailored blazer and produced a sleek silver encrypted flash drive. She held it up in the pulsing red and blue light. "This drive contains the complete verified forensic data scrape. It includes the fraudulent property deeds, the IP addresses used to bypass the short-term rental platform's security protocols, the direct routing numbers to 3 illegal offshore gambling syndicates in Macau, and the exact time-stamped ledger of $80,000 in stolen deposits currently being floated through corporate embezzlement." Russo took the flash drive, his expression hardening, as he processed the sheer volume of felonies Kendra had just casually listed. He slid the drive into his evidence pouch, and the suspects— Kendra did not even turn her head. She simply raised her hand and pointed a single perfectly manicured finger directly at Julian Blackwood. "The man in the linen suit hovering near the kitchen island," Kendra said, her voice ringing out so every single person in the room could hear her. "Julian Blackwood. He orchestrated the digital wire fraud, broke into a sealed, privately owned estate, and is currently operating an illegal commercial enterprise on stolen property." Russo gestured sharply to the uniformed officers. "Take him." 3 officers moved with terrifying, coordinated speed. Julian's eyes widened in absolute primal terror. The drunken arrogance that had fueled his entire evening vanished completely. He looked frantically at the kitchen doors, then at the sweeping staircase, calculating a route of escape. There was none. He was entirely boxed in. "Wait, hold on, you cannot do this," Julian stammered, holding his hands up as he took a clumsy step backward. His expensive boat shoes slipped on the polished floor. "This is a misunderstanding. This is my brother's house. I have permission to be here. Connor, tell them. Tell them I have permission." Connor did not speak. He was still kneeling on the floor, paralyzed by the weight of Xavier's divorce filing and the $18 million net worth currently burning a hole in his retinas. He did not even look up at his brother. Connor! Julian shrieked, his voice pitching upward in pure panic. Do something! The officers did not hesitate. They closed the distance instantly. One officer grabbed Julian's right arm, twisting it sharply behind his back with practiced mechanical efficiency. Julian cried out, stumbling forward as his chest collided violently with the edge of the granite kitchen island. The sharp, heavy click of steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. Julian Blackwood, you are under arrest for suspicion of federal wire fraud, breaking and entering, and criminal trespassing, the arresting officer stated in a flat-board monotone, reciting the Miranda rights as he aggressively patted Julian down for weapons. Mom! Julian screamed, thrashing against the officer's grip. Mom, call our lawyers. Call somebody. Beatrice remained crumpled on the staircase, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with a horror so profound it seemed to age her a decade in a matter of seconds. She watched her youngest son being manhandled by local law enforcement in front of every single woman who had once envied her. She was entirely powerless. The sight of his brother in handcuffs finally snapped Connor out of his catatonic shock. The reality of the flashing police lights and the presence of the economic crimes detectives shattered his delusion of safety. He dropped the divorce papers. He scrambled awkwardly to his feet, his knees trembling so violently he had to brace himself against the glass coffee table. Connor looked toward the front door. Richard Sterling, his chief executive officer, was standing near the entryway, quietly providing his own contact information to Detective Russo. Sterling was executing a flawless corporate distancing maneuver, ensuring the police knew the firm was a victim, not an accomplice. Connor stumbled forward, his polished facade entirely gone. He looked like a desperate cornered rat. Richard, please. Connor begged, his voice cracking loudly as he lunged toward his boss. The uniformed officers instinctively moved to block him, but Sterling raised a hand, signaling them to wait. Sterling wanted to handle this personally. Connor stopped inches away from the man who held his entire life in his hands. Richard, I swear to God I can fix the accounts. Give me until Monday. I will liquidate my own portfolio. I will work for free. I will sign whatever non-competes you want. Just do not let them press charges. If the firm presses charges, I am going to federal prison. You cannot do this to me. I built the Eastern Seaboard portfolio for you. Sterling looked at Connor with a gaze so entirely devoid of human empathy, it was chilling. It was the look of a predator examining a diseased carcass. You built nothing, Connor, Sterling said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried absolute authority. You operated on the infrastructure this firm provided, and you abused the trust placed in your title. You used my company's capital to fund a frat party in a stolen house because you were too weak to control your own family. Sterling stepped closer, invading Connor's space, forcing the younger man to shrink backward. You are officially terminated with cause effective immediately, Sterling announced, making absolutely sure the detectives heard every single word. I am freezing your assets. I am seizing your corporate accounts. And first thing Monday morning, I am unleashing a team of federal auditors and corporate litigators to completely dismantle your entire life. You are not just fired, Connor. I am going to make absolutely certain that you never work in the financial sector again. You will be lucky if you can secure a job managing a cash register when the feds are done with you. Sterling did not wait for a response. He turned, offered a polite nod to Detective Russo, and walked out into the night. Connor let out a raw, guttural sound of pure despair. His legs gave out again, and he collapsed back onto the floor, pulling his knees to his chest, burying his face in his hands. He was 32 years old, and his life was entirely over. He had no job, no money, no leverage, and a team of relentless corporate lawyers coming for his throat. The officers began dragging Julian toward the front doors. Julian was sobbing openly now, his shoes dragging across the floor, his head hanging in total defeat. The flashing lights caught the silver of his handcuffs, a brutal reminder of the reality I had promised them. As Julian was hauled through the grand entryway, disappearing into the back of a waiting police cruiser, the absolute finality of the situation settled over Beatrice. Her golden children were destroyed. Her stolen kingdom was a crime scene. Her reputation was a toxic wasteland. She crawled forward. She did not stand up and walk. She literally crawled across the Italian tile on her hands and knees. Her wine-soaked dress dragged heavily behind her. She moved past her weeping, broken eldest son and dragged herself directly to my feet. I looked down at her. I did not move. I did not offer a hand. Beatrice reached out with trembling, desperate fingers. She grabbed the hem of my custom emerald green designer gown, clutching the expensive silk like a drowning woman clinging to a life raft. Her face was a ruin of smeared makeup tears and abject terror. The arrogant, elitist matriarch who had spent years treating my parents like unwanted servants, who had sneered at my background, who had actively conspired to steal my property and bankrupt me, was now kneeling in the dirt at my feet. But even in her total destruction, Beatrice's mind could not comprehend the reality of her position. She still believed somewhere deep in her twisted, narcissistic psyche that she could negotiate from a position of superiority. "Jasmine, please!" Beatrice sobbed, her voice a wet, pathetic rasp. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and pleading. "Please, you have to stop this. You have to call the police off Julian. You have to talk to Richard Sterling. You can fix this. We are family. We are your family." I stared down at her hands gripping my dress. I did not say a word. Beatrice mistook my silence for hesitation. She tightened her grip, pulling herself up slightly, her voice taking on a sickening, condescending tone of forced compromise. "I will make it better," Beatrice promised, nodding frantically, her delusional bargaining kicking into overdrive. "I will change, I promise I will change. If you just fix this, if you just give Connor his life back, I will allow your parents to come over. I will. I will let Jerome and Vivian visit the house. I will even let them sit at my dining table for the holidays. I will treat them like equals. Just please make this go away." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her statement hung in the air. She was offering to allow my parents, a brilliant surgeon and a respected architect, the privilege of sitting at a table she did not even own in a house she had tried to steal to save her felon sons. I looked at the woman who had tormented my family for years. I looked at the hands ruining the hem of my silk gown. I reached down, my movements slow and deliberate. I grabbed Beatrice by the wrists. I did not squeeze gently. I applied a sharp, agonizing pressure, forcing her fingers to release the fabric of my dress. I peeled her hands away and dropped them back onto the cold tile. I took a slow step backward, elevating myself above her pathetic, kneeling form. My voice was completely devoid of empathy, anger, or mercy. It was the voice of absolute, untouchable authority. "This is my house," I said, looking down into her terrified eyes. "Get out." The remaining uniformed officers did not need any further instruction. They immediately began clearing the property, methodically moving through the grand living room, the kitchen, and the sprawling outdoor patio, loudly directing the wealthy, terrified guests toward the front exit. The country club elite, desperate to avoid having their names entered into a police report regarding an illegal gambling and embezzlement syndicate, scrambled out the doors with their heads down. Within 10 minutes, my $450,000 coastal estate was completely emptied of the parasites who had tried to claim it. The subsequent 90 days constituted a masterclass in legal and financial annihilation. I did not simply divorce Connor Blackwood. Under Xavier's ruthless orchestration, I dismantled his entire existence brick by brick. The corporate fallout was instantaneous and utterly devastating. Richard Sterling made good on his promise the very next morning. A team of relentless corporate litigators and forensic auditors descended upon Connor's office. They seized his hard drives, confiscated his firm-issued devices, and initiated a massive internal review of every single client portfolio he had ever managed. When they formally presented their findings to the federal authorities, the sheer volume of Connor's corporate embezzlement triggered a multi-agency investigation. Connor was officially indicted on 3 counts of federal wire fraud, 1 count of grand larceny, and a litany of SEC violations, that guaranteed he would never legally touch another financial asset for the rest of his natural life. Xavier handled the divorce proceedings with the cold, mechanical precision of a butcher. During the mandatory depositions, Connor attempted to deploy his usual corporate charm wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit he had purchased off the rack because his bespoke wardrobe had been seized to cover his mounting legal debts. He tried to argue that the $150,000 he stole from my decoy account was a mutual marital investment. Xavier calmly projected the time-stamped IP logs, the forged property transfer deed, and the recorded video of Connor explicitly admitting to the theft. The family court judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for financial abuse, did not hesitate. The final divorce decree was brutally swift. Connor was legally ordered to repay the entire $150,000 he had drained from my account. Furthermore, because he had engaged in malicious financial fraud designed to intentionally bankrupt his spouse, the judge levied massive punitive damages against him. His remaining personal bank accounts were completely frozen, his assets were liquidated, and his future wages, assuming he ever managed to secure employment outside of a prison laundry facility, were heavily garnished. Connor was left utterly and completely destitute. The man who had once mocked my ambitions, who had sneered at my parents, who had firmly believed his mediocre corporate title made him a god, was now entirely stripped of his power. Evicted from the luxury apartment he could no longer afford, blocked from contacting any of his former colleagues, and drowning in insurmountable legal debt, he was forced to move into a cheap, dilapidated motel on the absolute outskirts of the city. The fallout for his family was equally catastrophic. Julian's arrest had triggered a massive cascade of criminal charges. The federal prosecutors did not offer a plea deal. They hammered Julian with the full weight of the law, leveraging his illegal short-term rental operation, his connection to offshore gambling syndicates, and his role in the wire fraud conspiracy. He was denied bail, deemed a flight risk due to his international gambling ties, and remanded to a federal holding facility to await a trial that carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years. Beatrice, suddenly faced with the terrifying reality of her youngest son rotting in federal prison, panicked. She frantically dialed every single favor, every connection, and every wealthy friend she had spent decades manipulating at the country club. She begged them for loans, for character references, for anything that could help secure a high-powered criminal defense attorney for Julian. Every single call went straight to voicemail. The women she had golfed with, the socialites she had gossiped with, the elite circle she had valued above basic human decency, completely excised her from their reality. The final crushing blow arrived via certified mail just 2 weeks after the raid on my property. It was a formal, legally drafted letter from the board of directors at her prestigious country club. They were officially revoking her membership, citing a morals clause, and explicitly stating that her family's active federal indictments were a stain on the institution's pristine reputation. With no allies and no other options, Beatrice was forced to turn to her only remaining asset. She contacted a discount real estate broker and hastily listed her pristine, heavily mortgaged suburban home. The house that had served as the physical manifestation of her manufactured high society life was sold at a massive loss just to cover Julian's initial legal retainers. Beatrice was forced to pack her designer clothes into cardboard boxes and relocate to a cramped, two-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood she used to mock. The entire facade of her white picket fence aristocratic existence was reduced to absolute ashes. I sat at my mahogany desk in my home office reviewing the final court-stamped divorce decree. The paperwork was pristine, verifying my absolute financial independence and total legal separation from the Blackwood family. I closed the file and set it aside, feeling a profound, quiet sense of closure. My smartphone buzzed on the desk. I glanced at the screen. It was an incoming text message from an unregistered prepaid cellular number. I opened the message. "Jasmine, please. It is Connor. I know you hate me. I know I ruined everything, but I am sleeping in a motel that smells like mildew and cigarette smoke. I have nothing left. The firm took everything. The lawyers took the rest. I was stupid. I was arrogant. I was blind. I am so incredibly sorry. I finally see your worth. I finally understand what you were trying to build. Please, just give me one more chance. Let me show you I can be the man you deserve. Just 5 minutes on the phone. Please. I read the pathetic, groveling words twice. I imagined Connor sitting on a stained, sagging mattress in a dimly lit motel room, typing out that desperate plea with shaking hands, finally realizing that the woman he had tried to destroy was the only person who had ever truly held the power in their dynamic. He did not see my worth. He saw my $18 million net worth, and he was starving for a lifeline. I did not reply. I did not type a witty comeback. I did not offer a single shred of closure. I simply tapped the options menu, deleted the message, and permanently blocked the number. Connor Blackwood no longer existed in my universe. 6 months later, the coastal Rhode Island air was warm, carrying the crisp, salty scent of the Atlantic Ocean directly onto my master balcony. I stood leaning against the polished glass railing, the morning sun warming my skin. The $450,000 estate was entirely cleansed of the dark, frantic energy the Blackwoods had brought into it. It was no longer a crime scene. It was no longer a disputed asset. It was exactly what I had designed it to be. From my vantage point on the second floor, I had a perfect unobstructed view of the sprawling back patio. The commercial-grade outdoor sound system, which I had legally retained and properly wired, was playing a smooth, upbeat jazz playlist at a respectful ambient volume. Jerome. My father was standing at the massive outdoor grill. He was wearing a Hawaiian shirt and a pair of comfortable shorts, expertly flipping a row of marinated steaks. He threw his head back and laughed loudly at a joke Malik had just made. The heavy, lingering trauma of being threatened with arrest by corrupt local police officers had completely vanished from his posture. He looked vibrant, healthy, and entirely in his element. He looked like a man who knew he was safe. Through the open sliding glass doors leading into the gourmet kitchen, I could see Vivian. My mother was standing at the massive granite island, humming softly to herself as she arranged a vibrant, sprawling bouquet of fresh blue hydrangeas into a crystal vase. The tight, anxious lines that used to frame her mouth whenever Connor or Beatrice were mentioned were entirely gone. She moved with a light, graceful energy, completely at peace in the beautiful environment I had secured for them. My company had scaled exponentially in the 6 months since the divorce, with the dead weight of Connor's constant emotional sabotage finally removed from my daily routine. I had aggressively expanded my cybersecurity firm's operations. We had successfully opened 2 new international server hubs in London and Tokyo. The $18 million net worth that had caused Connor's knees to buckle was already an outdated metric. My financial trajectory was climbing at a staggering, unstoppable rate. But as I stood there feeling the ocean breeze lifting my hair, I did not think about the expanding international markets. I did not think about the corporate acquisitions or the growing revenue ledgers. I watched Jerome plate the steaks, handing one to Malik with a wide, genuine smile. I watched Vivian carry the hydrangeas out to the patio table, the morning light catching the silver in her hair. Today was their 45th wedding anniversary. This estate, this beautiful, secure coastal fortress, was the anniversary gift they had always deserved. It was a place where they would never be judged, never be belittled, and never be made to feel inferior by arrogant people masquerading as royalty. I picked up the crystal glass resting on the balcony railing and took a slow, deliberate sip of my sweet tea. The ice clinked softly against the glass. I looked out over the crashing waves of the Atlantic, reflecting on the brutal, exhausting journey of the past year. I had survived emotional manipulation, federal forgery, financial theft, and the vicious arrogance of a family that believed they owned the world. I had burned their fraudulent empire to the ground and built my own impenetrable fortress upon the ashes. I smiled, a genuine, serene expression that reached all the way to my eyes. True wealth was not the millions sitting in my diversified investment accounts. True wealth was not the title of chief executive officer, the designer gowns, or the sheer terror I could strike into the heart of a corrupt corporate executive with a single phone call. True wealth was the absolute, ruthless power to protect the people who actually loved me, and the unshakable peace of knowing that no one would ever be allowed to hurt them again. The most profound lesson from these experiences is that blood does not automatically define family, and you cannot heal in the same environment that broke you. For years, enduring the painful dynamic of being the scapegoat while a golden child is praised teaches you a harsh truth. Your worth is never determined by people who are committed to misunderstanding you. True freedom and success only arrive when you stop seeking validation from toxic relatives. By setting unbreakable boundaries and quietly building your own independence, you reclaim your ultimate power. Your greatest victory is simply thriving and realizing you are entirely enough on your own. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your peace and build your own success? Share your empowering story in the comments below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more journeys of healing and sweet revenge.